Good evening, everyone. I'm Shweta Chanda from Foundation for Democratic Reforms. Thank you to our esteemed panelists and all the participants for joining us for our webinar series, Crisis as Opportunity. Today's webinar, which is our third one, is on big city governance, creating a separate architecture for India's millions plus cities. We are hosting this in collaboration with Janaagraha, a policy and advocacy think tank in the space of urban governance. We at FDR are extremely grateful to all of the participants for their overwhelming support that made our previous webinars on healthcare and agriculture a huge success. I'm sure that this webinar will be equally insightful and engaging for all of us. The reason we are gathered here today is to discuss the challenges that our thriving big cities currently face and to collectively arrive at solutions for their better management. COVID-19 has brought the issue of urban governance to the forefront of public discourse. Today, we have a system of ineffective and underpowered urban local governments. As there is no effective transfer of functions, powers, and resources to the lowest tier of the government, people are unable to perceive the link between their vote and the public good, or hold governments to account, leading to non-performance and poor service delivery. It is therefore necessary to entrust urban governments with real power and adequate resources for them to discharge their local responsibilities and build a system of effective and accountable governance. To discuss this in greater detail, we have with us a very distinguished panel. First, we have with us Dr. Junaid Ahmad, who is the Country Director for the World Bank in India. We welcome you, sir. Next, we have with us Ms. Yamini Aiyar, the President and Chief Executive of Center for Policy Research, a leading think tank on public policy. We welcome you, ma'am. From Janaagraha, we have with us Ms. Swati Ramanathan, who is the co-founder of Janaagraha and who is also the chairperson of Jana Urban Space Foundation. We welcome you, ma'am. We also have with us Mr. Ramesh Ramanathan, who is also the co-founder of Janaagraha and the chairman of Janalakshmi Social Services. We welcome you, sir. Mr. Srikanth Vishwanathan is also here with us today. He is the Chief Executive Officer of Janaagraha and our co-host for today. So we welcome you, sir. And finally, we have with us Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan, former civil servant and General Secretary of Foundation for Democratic Reforms. Thank you for leading this initiative, sir. I would like to once again thank the Janaagraha team, Dr. Junaid Ahmad and Ms. Yamini Aiyar for joining us today. My colleague Vritti will now briefly state the format of the webinar and then we shall begin. Over to you, Vritti.
Thank you, Shweta. Give me a second before I share my screen. Thanks to all our panelists and the participants for joining us. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping rules. Each panelist will speak for 10 minutes, followed by a session summary by Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan. Post that, we'll have 1 hour question and answer session. We will address questions sent to us prior to the webinar and also few of the chat questions. As the strength of the panel is large, please keep your questions concise and address it directly to the panel member you intend to. If there are any technical glitches, please be assured that those will be resolved soon. Those were the broad points to keep for now. Now I would like to invite Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan to begin the session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Vritti, and thank you all for joining us, the distinguished panel and very enthusiastic participants from all over the world. This is the third in a series as we discussed. The idea is that moments of crisis perhaps give us a space, an opportunity to bring about changes for which there may not be appetite during normal times. And already the Prime Minister, for instance, talked about crisis as opportunity. Paul Romer is the man who said a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. That's the perspective in which we are having this series of webinars. Thank you for the overwhelming response. This particular webinar is only about the big cities, not all local governments. Ideally, all local governments require a fundamental change. But you live in today's world with the complexity and the resistance to change. And therefore, to expect that all the rural and urban local governments of India to change overnight is perhaps somewhat unrealistic. So the idea is look at only the big cities because the COVID crisis is essentially a big city crisis. Before going into the slides, let me just give some numbers. There are, in 2018, 5 big cities of more than 10 million population in India each, and 4 cities between 5 and 10 million. 9 of them above 5 million population. There are 52 between 1 and 5 million population. These are the cities we're really looking at, 61 of these cities. In 2030, these numbers are likely to be 7 will be about 10 million, 2 will be about between 5 and 10 million. At least these 9 will remain the same with a slight change. But the 52, right now we have 1 to 5 million, will increase to 62. 10 more cities will join the 1 million club. So at least can we do something significantly better for the larger city governments? That is the broad idea. There are, of course, another 49 cities today between 500,000 and 1 million. And in 2030, they are expected to be another 21 to join, 70 cities to join. Now, they may or may not be included in this framework depending on the political consensus, but it appears that it's absolutely essential that we must look at these 61 cities now, that is million plus cities. The COVID crisis in the relation to big cities, we all understand. If you take the 10 major cities of India, they accounted for 57% of the cases. On the screen, I think you're not looking at the numbers. Mumbai had 82,000 cases so far. Delhi, 94,000 cases. Chennai, 64,000. Hyderabad, 15,000. Pune, 25,000. But altogether, these cities alone, they account for 57%. So it's a big city crisis. On top of it, this whole migration crisis, the reverse migration on account of the distress that the poor in cities and the migrant laborers felt, that touched the hearts of everybody in the country and perhaps across the world. And if you don't wake up now and look at what's happening and introspect and look at changes, I think we're not being very fair to ourselves and our future. That's the context in which we're discussing this. Next slide, please. If you look at the migration crisis, for instance, is largely because of the housing crisis and the infrastructure crisis in big cities. Mostly the males come, the other members of the family, dependent members do not come. They're poor. Most of them have very ramshackle housing or extremely congested housing. Many don't even have any formal house. They actually live in the workplace. For instance, many construction workers live at the site of work until the builder provides some sanitary facilities. It's okay, otherwise somehow they survive. They work there, they eat there, they sleep there. And obviously when there is no work and everything came to a standstill, there's enormous crisis. So the crisis is not something that is not to be anticipated. It's inherent in the way the things are. It's not because of COVID. COVID merely exposed the fault lines. We must be candid in admitting that. Just some numbers we all know, but just for completion's sake, only about 30% of the urban households of India do not have a tap for the household. They may have a common tap somewhere. 65% they have no coverage of solid waste management at the household level. 88% have no sewerage connection across the whole country. I'm not talking about big cities alone. These are horrific numbers. And if you don't address this crisis, at least in big cities, I think the writing is on the wall. We must really emphatically make it public and repeatedly harp on this theme that we cannot allow our cities to be ghettoized and criminalized and become vast slums and urban sprawl, and that simply is not in the interest of the country. There's an 18.78 million shortage as of 2012. Today, probably it's 20 million plus shortage, particularly for the poor. Another statistic shows that about 10 million houses are in surplus for the upper class homes. So there's no problem there for whatever reasons, because urban values are going up and people want to invest in urban property, so that's one durable asset and so on and so forth. But for the poor, the large migrant population, and that's increasing every day with the rapid urbanization, India is still at only 35% or so. We are soon going to be 50 or 60, otherwise there's no modernization. The dream that we'll have a predominantly rural India is an absurd dream in 21st century. And if anything, the crisis will grow, the housing demand will grow, and we have to address these challenges very swiftly. Next, please. We all know this. I will skip this now. Cities are the powerhouses of the economy. You like it or not. I myself grew up in a village. I went to a panchayat school, a Jayaprakash school, and all that stuff. But the romanticism apart, you like it or not, the economy is urban-centric, much of the world. And if you don't recognize that, we are being somewhat unrealistic. No, when we were kids, some of you may or may not recall, because many of you, I think, are younger to me. Shoemaker's book, I don't know, Dr. Ahmad, if you recall, Small is beautiful, was very popular and fashionable. Today, I think nobody seriously believes that. I really want it, but I know it will not happen. Therefore, you like it or not, urbanization is inevitable. It is part of modernization, part of industrialization, part of 20th century, 21st century. How to do it in a manner that is humane, that is economically productive and socially harmonious is the only challenge. Therefore, for us to now go back and say, let's not have cities and towns is, I think, somewhat absurd. Certainly, you can reduce migration to distant big cities to some extent by creating, by encouraging migration to small towns by building infrastructure, making them more attractive. But even then, migration to big cities will be unstoppable. Unless you actually use draconian methods like they do in China, the hukou system or something where without a permit you can't go into site, even that doesn't work beyond a point. I don't think that's what we're really looking at in this country. And therefore, you have to empower and make the local governments effective and accountable. That's a broad thing. Next, please. World over, it doesn't require much for the educated people of the subcontinent. New York, London, Seoul, Bangkok, take any city. These cities are vibrant, effective, autonomous local governments. And the mayors of those cities are potentially the next presidents or prime ministers of the country. Boris Johnson. I remember talking to the prime minister some 12, 14 years ago. I asked him about name of the mayor of Mumbai, Chennai, Hyderabad, Delhi, Kolkata. He did not know a single name, nor did I know, to be truthful. I said, mayor of London, New York, everybody knew, whether Boris Johnson or Bloomberg or somebody else. And of course, Mexican president today is a former mayor of Mexico City. London, the British Prime Minister is the former mayor of London, so on and so forth. The fact that our city mayors are not even known across the country, the fact that our city leaders are not recognized as important players in the political space and social space is a disgrace. India is the only exception. I remember visiting China in 2005. Of course, China is autocratic and so on and so forth. We all know that. But despite that, the power of the local governments, within the broad framework laid down by the central, what they call central, I don't like the word central, but because China uses that more or less legally and calling it central, in India, I think we should use only union government. The power of the local governments is awesome. And every entrepreneur who goes to China to invest, he comes back with stories that they don't have to meet anybody at the provincial level or at the national level. All they have to do is do business with the local officials. Things get done, period. And therefore, for us to claim that this centralization, we are really a bastion of democracy and a beacon of freedom, it's not entirely acceptable. It's only partly true. We must be candid about it. Next, please. The problems we all know. As Sweta mentioned, and as we all know, the 73rd, 74th amendments are very well-meaning, but unfortunately created a rigid, overstructured framework with very little genuine empowerment. Now, that was 25 years ago, now 27 years, actually, 1993, it was done. Great anticipation. I remember meeting some of the ministers at the time at the union level, state level, pleading with them, now is the opportunity, let's push this forward. But last 25 years was the last opportunity. We have to do something significant. The commissioners call the shots everywhere. Commissioners are transferred every other day. A latest slide, I hope will show. Just to give you a flavor, Raipur city had 8 commissioners in 5 years. Ludhiana had 6 in 5 years, all in 5 years. Jaipur had 6, Chandigarh 5, Trivandrum 5, Chennai 4, Bhopal 4, Patna 4, Dehradun 4, Hyderabad, Mumbai, Ahmedabad, Kanpur, Surat, and Pune, 3 each, all in 5 years. Just to take one indicator of the ad hocism. And of course, commissioners are all powerful. The mayor is a ceremonial fellow. I keep saying publicly, mayors only have one function. They wear those funny garbs when the prime minister or president comes and then go to the airport to receive them. Otherwise, there's hardly any role at all in most cases. Let's be truthful. Next, please. Next slide. This is an interesting slide. It's only a partial slide. Pre-1947, colonial India, the towering leaders of India were all earlier local government leaders and rose to national stature. Rajendra Prasad, the chair of the Constituent Assembly and the first president of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, Vallabhbhai Patel, Subhash Chandra Bose, Chakravarti Rajagopalachari, Firoz Shah Mehta, a very important name is missing, Subhash Chandra Bose's mentor, Deshabandhu Chittaranjan Das, then somebody like Jayaprakash, all these towering leaders from all over the country. They matured in local governments and became nationally, iconic figures. Post-independence, pre-1993 amendment, though we started the experiment only in 1958 in rural governments, but urban was there even before. This is only a partial list. If everybody is a chief minister or one or two cabinet ministers at the union level, 24 chief ministers we could count. Many of them significant chief ministers, not merely run-of-the-mill, fly-by-night operators. Serious chief ministers who made significant contributions to their state and the nation. 24 chief ministers and at least 2 union ministers. This is only a partial list. We only could survey some of the states. Post 1993, that's the only list you have. Devendra Fadnavis, the only chief minister in that list. And with some difficulties, some MPs and deputy chief ministers and ministers, we found Rita Bahuguna Joshi. Then a couple of other names, which are concealed by the pictures here. M.K. Stalin and Dinesh Sharma. And in this list, we all know that 2 of them, Rita Bahuguna Joshi and M.K. Stalin, their rise in politics is not because of their local government experience. They entered local governments as chiefs and they're in politics and they have a certain stature because of their pedigree. So really speaking, post-1993, in 25, 27 years now, there is no leadership development in local governments. It's one of the most tragic things in India. Perhaps India is an outlier in this respect. We have to recognize this. Next, please. Therefore, and this is, I'm making this case with extreme care and caution. Reservations are necessary in a country like India with enormous poverty and centuries of deprivation and discrimination. Representational aspirations of various groups are absolutely legitimate and we have to fulfill. That's what democracy is about. But for the executive office, particularly in big cities, if you reserve in a very narrow way, the reservations are constituted as scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, backward classes, in each category again women, and in the open category again women. That means there are 8 broad classes of reservations. Once the reservation for the mayor's office is made to one of these categories, it becomes too narrow a field for leadership recruitment. The second is, once you have such a large number of reservations, multiple categories, when 75% reservations in most of the states of India, because 50% of women in any case across the board, and you have SC, ST, BC again in all these categories, 75% reservation on an average, you will only have a chance to contest again after 4 terms. Even if you emerge as an acknowledged leader, you are successful, people want you, your chance on an average comes only after another 4 terms. There cannot be leadership development. We must have reservation in the representative capacity. We can even have an improved model to make it much more robust. But once that is there, supposing the elected councillors, they elect the mayor. After all, when the councillors, 60 to 75% of them have come through the reservation principle, and they represent the aspirations of the marginalized sections. Certainly, they will choose leaders who will represent those aspirations. The moment you have a narrow field of reservations statutorily made, you are now having all kinds of odd choices and no leadership development. And there's no continuity. That's the reason why the local governments failed to throw up any kind of worthy leadership in the past 27 years, not because there's no leadership available locally. There's immense leadership available. I have seen myself at various levels, some very accomplished people, a Google middle level and senior level executive, a former naval commander, and many other people. I've seen people that are contesting in panchayats, in small towns. They're willing, but within no time they're discouraged and they go away from that. And if they do actually function well for 5 years, they're not heard of again for the next 20 years, and that's it, end of story. So we are actually diminishing our democracy by not giving ourselves a chance to develop leaders. And therefore, our pleas, I know this is prone to all kinds of misinterpretation. We do need representational reservation. There's no question about India, given our social and political conditions. But for the The highest office is the executive, like a prime minister or a chief minister. We have reservations elsewhere. But we don't believe that you require a reservation formally for a chief minister. Many people from disadvantaged backgrounds became very prominent chief ministers. Today, Prime Minister Narayan is from a disadvantaged background, but he's a national leader authentically. So they automatically emerge. You don't have to have for the executive office in big cities reservation. I deliberately wanted to spend some time on this so that there's no confusion on what we're articulating, and there is a genuine understanding of an open mind. Instead of making it an acerbic issue or a very polarizing issue. I know how polarizing this can be in the Indian context. And in whatever manner the mayor is chosen, there must be a 5-year tenure and there must be real power centered on the mayor. The mayor must be, she or he must be the effective, de facto chief executive, not a ceremonial office. And the commissioner must be fully accountable with a guaranteed tenure of 3 years, chosen in consultation with and with the consent of the mayor. That is the heart of the issue. Once these basic things are in place, the rest of it, I'm sure the local government and the people, they'll figure out the solutions. Next, please. Obviously, the 12th schedule and 11th schedule in case of panchayats, we have, I think, 18 subjects covered in the 12th schedule, but in reality, you know what is happening. There must be, let there be genuine transfer, but with accountability. With accountability. I'm not one of those who argues that local governments are all wonderful, and I don't have a romantic notion that people are beautiful and Delhi is bad and Hyderabad is bad, Bengaluru is bad. That is somewhat churlish. The broader point we're making is let there be accountability with authority so that people can rise and make their voice heard and they can participate in shaping, because cities have talent, cities have ability, cities are problem solvers. Today, the finest citizens are problem solvers and experienced people and experts. They have become mendicants, not partners in changing things. This just is not on. This is not in the interest of our cities. Therefore, let the state have all the accountability. Your land is controlled by the state. Anyway, the law and order is controlled by the state. We are not arguing that India should go the American way where the law and order is controlled by the city mayor. Certainly not in today's India. We are talking about the 12th schedule subjects. The basic services to be delivered and have accountability mechanisms. An ombudsman, will come to it later, but I want to place it up front. An ombudsman system appointed by the government, but independent ombudsman within the framework of Lokpal, Lokayukta, with all the safeguards, the guaranteed tenure, independence, autonomy, and accountability to the Lokpal, Lokayukta, etc. You have citizens' charters, enforce them effectively. And we have monitoring mechanisms. The state government has a stake. Certainly, this is part of India. This is a part of a state. Bengaluru is a part of Karnataka. Nobody can say that the state government has no role in Karnataka, in Bengaluru city's future. But that role should not be in managing on a day-to-day basis, but monitoring regularly and ensuring effective coordination and ensuring accountability. So they're not losing power. It's not a zero-sum game. I want to plead with the leaders of this country. It is not a zero-sum game. The states will not lose. They actually gain in stature because they'll rediscover a greater role. With economic liberalization, the Delhi's licensing role has come down, but nobody seriously argues that Delhi's overall role actually has diminished. Delhi's role and stature actually have been enhanced after 1991. The governments will do what they're supposed to be doing. Right now, they're doing what somebody else at a lower level or smaller level is supposed to do. It's diminishing them, diminishing the local governments. Most of all, it is underserving the people of this country. And we all know the consequences. That is the broader picture. Therefore, strong accountability mechanisms, charter, ombudsman, revenue and monitoring, etc., etc. Next, please. I'll only make 1 or 2 points. The rest I'll leave to Janaagraha team because we're experts on the subject and they will go into the granular detail and the technical and managerial issues. You take the big picture, the funding of local governments. Obviously, we expect that there'll be significant taxation at the local level. Urban, of course, there is a possibility, but even there, we have to have innovative mechanisms. Today, I hope the experts will throw up some ideas as to what are the possible new avenues of taxation at the local level. But there's going to be a limitation. Given the Indian tax structure, the federal government, union government has the big share of the cake. That's the reason why there's a significant need for transfer from the union to the states and local governments. Then the states have a significant share. There's local governments, except property tax, there's hardly any significant tax available. Given that, devolution becomes necessary. And if you notice, take one state, Telangana, and I'm sure this is roughly the pattern all over the country. The Finance Commission, State Finance Commission transfers in Telangana are only 0.75% latest. Under 1% of the total tax revenues of the state, not 0.175% of the GDP, 0.75% of the Telangana state's tax revenues. And if we take the state's devolution to local governments, it's 384 rupees per capita. The union's devolution is double that. In most states, that is the pattern. This simply is not on. Next slide, please. Just to give a global picture, let's look at the United States, federal, state, and local levels. We're going to do more research in other federal countries like Germany, etc. But 49.32% of the expenditure of the total government at various levels, total public expenditure, is by the federal government. If you see the budget, the number appears to be higher, but I have taken out the transfers to state governments because that is mere transfer. It's not the federal expenditure. The state government spent 24.65% and local government spent 26%. Despite the fact that the federal government in the United States has taken enormous burdens which states normally bear in India, the welfare functions and much of the education, healthcare, most of the expenditure by the federal government. Despite that, the local governments are 26%. See India. Can you make it visible? Because the pictures are blocking the India part, the numbers, Sweta. In India, 34% is by the union government, excluding the transfers to states, the significant transfers to states. But the total public expenditure of India, which is 55 trillion rupees for those who are interested, roughly it comes to 55 lakh crores. Some of it is a guesstimate because local governments don't have accurate numbers. But because local government share is so minuscule, that error is not going to affect the larger picture. So 34.23%, or a little over 1/3. The state spent 60% for the reason I stated earlier. Most of the federal functions in the US are discharged by the states in India. The law and order, education, healthcare, and most of the welfare is substantially state expenditure in India. The local governments, including urban governments, 5.6%. This includes all the transfers to local governments for the federal and state governments. And of course, what there is locally, and then they spend minuscule. And within the local government, again, urban is a little better because they have their own resource base, which is better. Cities are a little better. But overall, it's completely an outlier. Indian local government spend about the lowest amount of money. Interstate as a share of the total public expenditure. Everybody knows in modern world, whoever controls the public purse has the real power. The power comes not from danda. That's second, but first is money and then danda. Next, please. Again, even in the big cities, the great cities of India, surprisingly, this is something surprising to me. In the past 5-6 years, there's an actual absolute decline as a share of GDP, these cities' expenditure, which of course is anyway minuscule, 0.29% of the GDP, 0.29, 1/4 of 1% almost. That became 0.23%. There's a further decline. So the trend is not very happy. Not only is it minuscule, it's actually declining even in great cities of India. Next, please. Therefore, there are 3 broad proposals. One is, obviously, there must be predictable fund devolution. The union government has, the 14th Finance Commission has devolved about 2.87 trillion rupees. But whatever the number, ideally we say it should be 30% of the transfer to states to local governments. It is not at the cost of the state because we're transferring the functions and the responsibilities and the expenditure. So there's no loss to the state. It's only whether this state at the state capital level or the local government is managing. Therefore, the fund ideally 1/3. But whatever be the number, instead of an ad hoc figure, since 10th Finance Commission, they're giving an ad hoc number. Give a proportion. A proportion of the state share will have to go to the local government, so it becomes more predictable. And make it on per capita basis, take the population, count by population, so people understand how much money is coming, they can hold the local government's account. That's the broad idea. Then the 12th schedule functions, you create a mechanism by which the states will transfer all those functions and the functionaries with the burden of paying salaries and give the salary grant to them. Take Andhra Pradesh, I'm very familiar with that. When I was a kid, primary health centers were managed by the local governments. The schools were all managed by the local governments. Many other institutions are managed by local governments. Eventually, they provincialized and the salaries are paid by the state. The primary health centers became a state issue. The local government, one of the reasons why India is managing, unlike Vietnam and other poor countries, relatively less elegantly this whole COVID crisis is, there is hardly any locally accountable primary healthcare system. Centralized healthcare system will not work. It may work in a hospital. It will not work in the first point of contact. I don't want to go into details. So we actually went in reverse in the country, not only pre-independence versus post-independence, even post-independence. What happened in the 60s and 70s has been completely reversed and we went in the direction of centralization. So send back these personnel to the local governments and send a salary grant and hold the state, the local government to account. Again, it's a revenue neutral measure. It's not giving more resources. It's actually transferring more responsibilities and more accountability. And of course, just as the union is now increasingly looking at local governments and transferring money, we have to make sure that the states transfer a like share. The union is transferring 42% of the tax revenues to states. If the states are transferring 2 or 3%, I think it's a disgrace. Telangana is transferring 7.78% or so. I mean, it's just not wrong. From the first tier to second tier, if X is transferred 42%, second tier to third tier, 1%, 0.5% is laughable. There must be some kind of a rationale in this, that there be broad consensus in that. Next, please. I think we're going to the last point from my side. Ward committees. Briefly, many of us know the Constitution says under 243 years, for any city of more than 300,000 population, there shall be subunits so that there's people's participation. They call them ward or wards committees. The idea, obviously, the wording of the Constitution and common sense tell us, the idea is that because even a 3 lakh city is too big for people to be able to effectively participate, let there be smaller units like a big village, 25 to 50,000 population, where they can be greater citizens' voice and create a formal mechanism. Now, first of all, we did not empower these ward committees, but what is the size of ward committees? Laughable. There are cases where 10 to 15 lakh people in Mumbai city, the old ward office system is converted into ward committee jurisdiction. And we have 24 ward committees in the whole of city of Mumbai, if I'm not mistaken, wards committees, each having 10 to 15 lakh population. Most other cities may not be that big numbers, but 5 lakh, 8 lakhs is common. It's ridiculous. The number must be mandated by the Constitution because the letter or the spirit must reflect what is intended there. And 2, genuine powers, at least a share of the municipal expenditure to the ward committee, not that they will spend from their hands, but the allocation is made at that level so that they make decisions as to priorities for public works and local needs and so on and so forth, with all accountability mechanisms. Next, please. I think we're coming to the last. These points I'll cover, I will let Janaagraha team cover. But one word about housing, because we talked about housing. Unless a massive national program is taken up for public housing in cities, at least 20 million dwelling units in the next 5 years, and even then we'll be only running after our shadows. We'll be catching up with the past problem, but we'll not be catching up with the future problem. But at least that's the minimum required initially. And create in a manner that there is a low-income families can acquire ownership over time. Let it not be completely freebie by the government subsidy going to there, but let there be some mechanism of easy installments, tenant owning eventually. But equally important, I think it's not listed here, a mechanism to integrate all communities. Singapore has a wonderful model where mandatorily every single ethnic group is represented in every single housing project. Here too, I think in the allocation of these houses, we must make sure that our caste, religion, region, and language, unless this mix is there, ghettoization of Kannadigas in one place, and Marathis in one place, and Hindus in one place, Muslims in one place, and then criminalization eventually, I think that will be a disaster for the country, both for social integration, for the economic growth, harmony, and peace. We desperately need integration, and wherever public housing is there, government has a right to decide how to allocate. We may not be able to tell the private sector what to do, who should live where, but certainly it's a big number, and this is where the real challenges are. And these are hardworking people who are contributing to the cities. We need to treat them as human beings with dignity, and we must ensure the integration. And we must give them stakes in the city's life. And there must never be another mass migration reverse to a village because of a crisis like COVID crisis, and with enormous heart-rending tragedy affecting all of us across the world. I think I come to the end. Anything else? Next. Yeah, conclusion. The points we made so far. The migration is going to be unstoppable. We can certainly try and manage it better by creating other magnets, but I don't see how we're going to be able to reduce significantly migration to big cities. They will grow. But unless they grow in a responsible way with citizen participation, we have a disaster on our hands. And my plea to the states is, it is not a zero-sum game. You are not losing anything. You are parting with pain. And you are retaining the authority to actually shape the future instead of micromanaging. Please look at this. And this is only a small subsector of the whole country. Just 61 cities of India. And you have seen what's happening. And hold the accountability instruments in your hand. Let us get going. This is not the only way. This is not written in stone. A broad outreach, a broad approach. And I'm sure the states will innovate, they'll think better, and they'll adapt the best practices of the world, cities, and do a better job. But we have to do something fast. Thank you. May I request the Janaagraha team, Ramesh, Swati, Ramesh, and Srikanth to make their presentation, and then we'll move on to the experts panel, Dr. Ahmad, and then Yamini.
Swati, do you want to start, and then I can give a few comments and hand over to Srikanth?
Yes, Ramesh.
Shweta, you can pull this up when, yeah, thank you.
Okay, hold on 1 minute. Yeah, so is this the presentation?
Ramesh?
Ms. Swati, is this the presentation? I can't hear you. Ms. Swati, if you can unmute yourself.
Apologies, I'm just trying to reduce my screen. 1 second.
Yes.
Okay. It's always a challenge being after JP, speaking after JP, but so nevertheless, it's good to be here and once again discussing our favorite topic, cities. I think over the last 10 years, after decades of being orphaned, I think finally cities have certainly made an emphatic entry into the political psyche as a force to be reckoned with. And this is especially true of our large cities, both because of the sheer size as a constituency, you know, with 300 million and then expanding over the next 2 decades to 500 million. This can make or break political careers. So this is clearly where a center plate and also the financial engines that power our state economies and the magnets that attract global business, the source of jobs for millions. But none of us will dispute that in Indian cities, we can throw a stone in any direction and at any distance, and we may be sure it will hit a problem. So COVID has been a wake-up call of global proportion. And while I would say that this horse has already bolted the stable, it's certainly a wake-up call to our leaders and to all of us on how we will be prepared for any subsequent disasters. And in the case of COVID, it is more likely than not that the consequences are going to be felt mostly in our cities. So JP, you've provided a stellar overview already, and Srikanth, I know, will be providing a framework for reforms. I think between Ramesh and I, we have about 10 minutes. I'm going to be really quick. I want to just provide 3 vignettes on some of the points, touching most of the points that you had, from the points that you have made. The first one is that in any disaster management effort, we have to reach the last mile of the individual citizen. But big city governments have not put in place reliable platforms to engage with its citizens. You know, when was the last time you talked about the mayors and none of us even being able to name our mayors? When was the last time we met our councillor? The expansion of the population in our million-plus cities has essentially weakened any democratic engagement of citizens with their local government. And you talked about Mumbai and the ward committees. In Bangalore, for example, if you have a population of 1.2 crores, we have a representative for 60,000 people, we have 1 representative. You know, by contrast, if I take a city like Tanjavur, which has a population of 2.2 lakhs, we have 1 representative for every 5,000 people. So the big city gap distance is huge. It's tenfold in this instance. So is it any wonder that our states have actually not empowered local government simply because there's no, even perception of a value add? What if instead we had meaningful platforms for citizen engagement in place? The ward committees which you talked about are truly largely ineffective. But this is in part because a ward also is too large to allow any kind of meaningful engagement. So an appropriate cluster for participation is around the existing polling booths, 2 to 4 booths forming a cluster of 500 to 1,000 households, providing adequate representation at the ward level. It's similar in size to the Gram Sabhas in villages. Now, while the central government, included the area Sabha as part of the reforms package under JNNURM, other than the Delhi government, which introduced the Mohalla Sabha, no other state has had much traction. And if you look at the benefits of such localized focus in a disaster situation, it's threefold. The transmission of information in a timely manner at the last mile without any delays, followed by quick decision-making which carries people along and resulting in swift, corrective actions, whatever those are. The second is the ad hoc expansion of our cities have resulted in the ad hoc boundaries of our civic services. And with no alignment, many overlaps. One almost needs a training program to know where to go and whom to approach for our various needs. So when there is no geographic alignment to organizing the many city services, in a disaster situation, this results in tremendous confusion and very poor coordination. Even the most capable, whether we have an elected mayor or the chief minister, as it has been in most states, driving the effort, along with however capable their teams are, they will despair of trying to make sense of what's actually happening at ground level. I think I want to, if you can pull up, Shweta, if you can pull up the two maps that I have, 2 slides on maps of the schizophrenia in Bangalore, I think at this point, just a very quick brief look. Are you able to pull it up?
Which is the one? Is this the one?
It's the
or
second
is this the one?
Side. The first is just some general slide. The second and the third.
Yeah. So I'm on the second slide.
Okay, super. So you can see the water supply and the power lines, and you see the lines with the base lines are the ones of the wards, the ward boundaries, the municipal wards. And the ones on top of it are the schizophrenia of all the various lines, one on power and one on water supply. And then if you go to the next slide, you will see the police, which played a very significant role, in the COVID response. Again, their lines. And between the 3 of them also, there is no match. So you don't know who to go to, So instead, if all civic agencies and their departments, the police beats, the bus services, the public health facilities, public schools were all organized around the same boundaries, then the humongous task of coordination, the allocation of responsibility that JP talked about, and managing the crisis becomes decentralized and that much easier. The third and the last point I want to make is on the technical capacity, which again you talked about. With the growth of our cities, the increase comes, alongside it, the complexity increases. The complexity of planning, of development of projects, of implementation. And our governments, frankly, simply cannot cope with its current very wide base at the bottom and a very small number at the top of qualified people in that pyramid. If I just take the issue of urban planning, which is one of my favorite topics, we talk so much about resilient cities, sustainable cities, and all these other progressive kinds of cities. But there are multiple gaps in our entire process currently. How well are our plans, prepared? Whether the projects that the plans propose are actually implemented, and to what extent the building regulations in the master plan, which direct us all on what we can build, how much we can build, are actually followed. So let me take one example because I don't want to get into a stream of planning. But it also is related to the overlaps from my second point. In order to plan our urban agglomerations, we need to take into account the larger footprint of the surrounding region. This is where it has significant impact on rural and on the formation of smaller satellite settlements, especially, around magnet cities. This requires at the very minimum a coordination of planning between all the planning authorities and the synchronization of the timelines between plans of validity and then plans of revisions of all the plans within this larger urban agglomeration region. So if Shweta, you can show the last slide, we prepare this for, and we're doing a study on the challenges of Greater Mumbai, and Ramesh and I wrote a paper on this. But if you look at this, you will see about 20 planning authorities in the larger metropolitan region of Mumbai. Now, none of these are synchronous with the comprehensive plan of the region. They're all at different points. And if we look at the 20 of these planning authorities, when they produce their plans, they produce 20-year plans. Most of them produce 20-year plans, some even 10, 15 years. But none of them is synchronous. How then can you possibly bring all of this together in a kind of a manner which makes sense? So improving the capacity of our cities in tackling urban delivery fundamentally requires, we do need to train our urban cadres across sectors. And I think, again, infusing expertise from private sector that can bring innovation, current progressive thinking in solving some of our most pressing challenges, I think will be of great value and benefit if we can make the government open to these kinds of this infusions. So I think in closing, I'd like to just close and say that we've been incessantly advocating urban reforms. Possibly our task at this point is to focus on certain reform priorities that can show tangible benefits to our city leaders in improving their ability to manage future crises. And I think therein we might have a sliver of an opportunity to push at least some of these proposals and suggestions forward. And with that, I will hand over to Ramesh. You will take over after this.
Yeah. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, Ramesh.
Okay. So let me just pick up on what JP and Swati have said. And I know that we have a running clock, so I won't take up very much time before I hand off to Srikanth. I'm not going to talk about specific aspects of reforms. Anybody who's tuning into a webinar like this on a Saturday afternoon is obviously an urban junkie already. So you've already thought about this issue, and you hopefully will acknowledge that cities have many challenges and cities are important to solve. There's one particular aspect of city that's actually fascinated Swati and me, which is frankly the reason that we've been working on urban issues for all these years, which is that they are at the intersection of two very interesting things. One is the sectoral and the spatial aspects, which means it doesn't matter what sector you're interested in, whether it's education or economic development, poverty or women's safety, affordable housing or public health. Cities are the place where these intersect. So that makes it really unusual. The second is that they are also the intersection of economic energies as well as political energies. So for both these reasons, this unusual combination of two different axes is what makes cities fascinating, but it's also the same reason that makes cities so incredibly complex. And therefore, we need reforms. Now, JP's talked about a bunch of reforms. You'll hear more from Srikanth, you'll hear from Junaid and Yamini as well. And my submission to those who are listening today is, it doesn't honestly matter what the reforms are. You could say, I agree with these reforms and I don't agree with these reforms. And in the mental map of the reforms that we all care about, there'll be a Venn diagram and there'll be some intersection of what our choice of reforms is. But the point is that we need some set of reforms, that the status quo is unacceptable. Anybody who argues that what we have today is an acceptable set of institutional arrangements and all that is needed is better execution or administration is frankly either not thinking seriously about this problem or is trivializing the problem. Now, what's the purpose of these reforms? Whatever these bundle of reforms that a collective set of well-meaning people can agree to, what's the purpose of it? And my submission is that ultimately the purpose of it is to provide a set of institutional arrangements that can help big cities deliver on a few things. What are these few things? One is to fulfill the promise of the economic opportunities that are available to the cities, to deliver on public services, to leave nobody behind, to make sure that the cities are truly inclusive, and to be able to be responsive when they're confronted by challenges. And those challenges will vary from city to city and will vary from time to time. COVID is obviously a black swan event that's affecting all cities at the same point in time, but this will go, this too shall pass, but some new challenges will emerge, which will be different in Mumbai and different in Chennai and different in Bangalore and Hyderabad and so on. But the intention of the institutional arrangements to be done in a certain manner is to allow cities to be responding to these and deliver on these promises. But who delivers on these promises? The people in these cities, both in the political system of our cities, as well as in the administrative system of our cities. And I want to spend a few minutes on this. These people are like you and me. They fall on some normal bell curve of both capability and intent. And so what we are betting on is that in that bell curve, some percentage of people with a reasonable amount of competence and a reasonable amount of good intentions are able to be effective. And that's really important. And for those who've thought about public institutions, I want to submit, because we've spent so much of our career in private institutions as well, the composition of this bell curve is no different whether you are in government or in the private sector. You can take it as a thumb rule that approximately 20 to 25% of people have that combination of capability and intent, and equal 20 to 25% of people have precisely the opposite set of intentions, which is to undermine the system, to break the rules, to tweak things to suit their intentions and so on. And the middle 50% are like the long blades of grass. They will sway whichever way the dispensation gives them a need to do. So the purpose of reforms is to enable that 20 to 25% to tilt the balance in their direction. And the truth of it is that today they are completely rendered incapable. In fact, it's a real tragedy. If you look at how our cities are run, you have this 20 to 25% of good, well-intentioned people coming and banging their head against an intractable problem, getting dispirited and disillusioned and failing. And if their failure itself is not enough of a tragedy, the bigger tragedy is that we are all collectively failing as a result of their failure because we have not given them the support that they need. I think we need to disabuse ourselves of the belief that we will have some grand, enlightened, super skilled savior who will come and be the person who's going to resurrect our cities. We need to acknowledge that institutions have long lives, good people are a small percentage, and the purpose of reforms is to allow good people to work against the odds and deliver reasonably acceptable outcomes. And that's why we need reforms. So, what's holding back? We have actually a vibrant political system in our country. We have political parties that have a very keen ear to the ground. If all of us who are outside the system are able to see the dysfunctionality and come up with a set of coherent ideas, clearly the political leaders have seen this too. What's preventing them from taking the next step? There can be two hypotheses on this. The first is that the status quo feeds a lot of mouths. The status quo gives an enormous amount of rent opportunities to those within the system. And the second is that this crisis is not big enough. The crisis of our big cities, the challenges that this throws up, this dysfunctionality is not big enough to warrant the attention of the political leadership. And I want to submit that the truth is a combination of both of these. Absolutely, the status quo helps people who have an interest in rent seeking, and that's the nature of the beast. But it's also true that the crisis is not big enough. It's not in our face. It's a silent crisis. It's very much like the frog in the bowl, which is boiled slowly. The frog never jumps out. But when it's put into a bowl of boiling water, it jumps out immediately. We in big cities are like the frog in the bowl that's being slowly boiled. The silent crisis in some sense creeping upon us. And therefore, there is no impetus. The inertia of the unfortunate equilibrium that we're in persists. So what do you need to dislodge this crisis? You need something that comes and changes the status quo. And that is why when JP reached out just barely a little over a week ago to say, let's talk about a few themes that make sense. And on the urban theme, let's use this COVID as an opportunity to rekindle a conversation around what can happen in our big cities. We felt that this resonated for us. So the truth is, we are facing a major crisis. And the truth is also, as everybody has said, and we all know, COVID is an opportunity, because what is the message of COVID? That the ultimate response is not a diktat from Delhi. The ultimate response is going to be the nimbleness of local responses. And what's true of COVID is frankly true of every other issue that we confront in our day-to-day lives. And this is at the heart of the message of subsidiarity, which is at the heart of the message of the bundle of reforms that we are talking about for our big cities. That if we can unleash the ingenuity of the people, both within and outside government, within a set of laid out rules of the game, then we can see magic happen. We don't have to have this happen in a linear fashion. This can be explosive, non-linear, extraordinarily fast velocity, even within the slow moving carcasses of our public institutions. So let me close with this point. In a democracy, what is the way, therefore, to change the status quo? It has to happen from the outside. And this webinar is not going to do the job, but there's 150 people listening in. If each of us can, be thoughtful and not let this end at 5 o'clock when the webinar ends, we can add the pieces together and some magic can happen. And if enough thoughtful people get engaged and start demanding changes to the way our cities are run, I have enough confidence that in our democracy, our system will respond. Let me hand over to Srikanth.
Thank you, Ramesh.
Thanks.
Srikanth.
Thanks, Ramesh. I'll split my my comments into two parts. One is what needs to be done, building further on what Dr. JP had said, and then spend a few minutes equally on how to break the status quo, building on what Swati and Ramesh have said. We can move to the next slide. So essentially, our focus in Janaagraha towards institutional reforms in cities is what you see below the iceberg, or city systems. We firmly believe, based on our work over the last 2 decades, that if we need to see transformation in quality of life, we need to transform city systems. City systems are laws, policies, institutions, institutional processes, which then lead to implementation and execution capabilities and performance. And we really believe if our city systems are broken, you're not going to see a transformation in quality of life. Any tactical patchwork band-aids that you put on quality of life is like filling a pothole and not like building a good road. And therefore, city systems underlie pretty much virtually every aspect of quality of life that is of any significance in our cities and what we experience in our daily lives. Next. We work through a city systems framework, which metaphorically we depict as 4 wings of a butterfly. The 4 city systems that we believe underlie quality of life are urban planning and design, urban capacities and resources, which primarily covers finances and staffing, but also technology. Thirdly, political leadership in the city, and lastly, transparency and citizen participation. Next. So we've, over the last 7 or 8 years, we've done about 5-6 editions of a study called the Annual Survey of India City Systems, where instead of measuring quality of life, we measure quality of city systems, essentially the quality of governance in our cities, as some kind of a forecast of how prepared are we to deliver quality of life improvement over a period of time. In the study, we've covered 26 cities across 20 states in India, and given that municipal laws don't differ very much between cities, you could largely say this is representative of the state of governance across urban India. Next. What we've seen, the footer to this graph is missing. Basically, we've depicted the clustering of cities. What you see as red dots, blue dots, and orange dots are clustering of cities based on their score in A6. They broadly fall within a score of 1 to 4, 4.5 on a scale of 0 to 10. And the 3 clusters that you see are 3 consecutive editions of A6 that we did in a range of about 3 to 4 years. Essentially, the message is nothing much is changing. The status quo is getting maintained, which is actually not good news, because as long as city systems remain static, quality of life is not going to remain the same. It's actually going to fall because of increasing pressure on land and public services. Indian cities typically have scored in a range of, on an average, 3.4 to 3.9 on 10, just to put some numbers behind it. So it's a case where it's not like there is any shining lighthouse in India that you can copy from. But there are some useful examples even from peer economies like South Africa, Philippines, Indonesia, etc. Next. The 5 key messages from our work in A6, and which also informs a lot of our work in Janaagraha, are the following. There is an acute lack of modern, contemporary framework of spatial planning of cities and design standards of public utilities, where both are equally important. Spatial planning refers to master planning over a long period of time, like what Swati alluded to. And design standards for public utilities speak about a design of roads and utilities around roads. Secondly, weak finances, both in terms of financial sustainability, which is essentially, do you have enough capital to invest? And do you have enough money to fund O&M expenditure, maintenance expenditure? And secondly, do you have assurance that that money is being spent well to achieve citizen outcomes? The third key issue is on human resource management. There are 4 aspects to it. There is a question of number of staff. There is an aspect of skills and competencies, because managing cities is not a generic skill. It is a very specialized skill, and there are multiple skills for different sectors. Thirdly, organization design aspects like span of control, and lastly, performance management. The fourth key issue is of empowerment of mayors and councils, on which Dr. JP has spoken at length. We have a few recommendations on that as well. And also the severe fragmentation of governance across municipalities, parastatal agencies, and state departments. And the fifth point is the total absence of systematic citizen participation and transparency. And this aspect of citizen participation and transparency is also important for building trust between citizens and governments across levels. And it is this breakdown in trust which will come to haunt us during times such as COVID, where when the government reaches out, seeking a set of actions from citizens, citizens may or may not be willing to fall in line because they do not trust the government. Next. I'm just going to focus on the top right-hand corner of the slides. There's a lot of data which all of you can absorb in good time, but in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on the top right-hand corner. Outdated Town and Country Planning Acts. On the LHS, you see the timeline that there have only been 3 legislations relating to Town and Country Planning Acts. And do remember that the governance of planning in India is not through the municipal acts. It happens through a separate legislation, generally called the Town and Country Planning Act. There are only 3 states or 3 cities in India which have amended post-economic liberalization to any meaningful degree. So most of them are hugely outdated. They are 20th century legislations trying to help us in the 21st century. Second, what Swati calls the planning pie, weaknesses in preparation, implementation, and enforcement of spatial development plans. And thirdly, lack of design standards. You'll be surprised that in Indian cities do not have codified enforceable design standards for roads. Swati has done a lot of work in this, and she has shown us drawings for roads on chits of paper made by municipal engineers. Whereas I was just looking at a city where my brother lives in the US, a very small town outside of Dallas, and their design standard for urban roads runs to 600 pages. Next. Going on to the next city system of urban capacities and resources. On finances, financial sustainability of municipalities is in a precarious position. On the LHS, you see a graph. I'll spend some time explaining this graph. The cities, basically the blue concentric circles represent cities with a population of greater than 5 million. The cities in yellow represent cities in the range of 1 to 5 million population. And the small red dot is less than 1 million. On the x-axis, which is the horizontal axis, you see owned revenue percentage on expenditure, and on the y-axis, you see capex per capita. And as you can see, in smaller cities, only 30% of their total expenditure is funded by owned revenue. 70% they are dependent on state and central government grants. And per capita expenditure is ridiculously low across tiers of cities. In fact, McKinsey estimate puts on an average, by and large, it's different for different categories of cities, capex per capita requirement at about $150, which would translate into, depending on exchange rates, anywhere between 6,000 to 10,000 rupees, which is at least at a minimum 3 times the capex per capita that you currently see. And we also have data that indicates that capex per capita in Indian cities may actually be falling despite notwithstanding flagship schemes of the government of India. And like you can see, even in cities in the range of 1 to 5 million, which by global standards are really large, also are at 35%. It's only the 5 million plus cities, you know, Ahmedabad, Hyderabad, Mumbai, Bangalore, etc., that have reasonable levels of self-sufficiency in financing. Financial accountability is broken, full stop. The fiscal pipeline through which money flows has leakages, and the bucket into which that water flows is also leaky. So there is fairly major fiscal plumbing overhaul that is required as far as financial accountability is concerned. Next. The next point is an interesting graphic on the LHS, where we've plotted the average number of commissioners, which Dr. JP had dwelt on in his presentation. On the y-axis, we have the average experience in urban departments. That's quite interesting. So again, the red dots are less than 1 million cities. The yellow circles are 1 to 4 million or 1 to 5 million, and the blue concentric circles are greater than 5 million. Let's just pay attention to the blue concentric circles, which is 5 million plus. They are cities where the commissioner of the city typically is of the level of an additional chief secretary or a chief secretary. Mumbai, for example, has a commissioner almost of the rank of a chief secretary, right? The ex-Mumbai commissioner who went on to be, occupy a mezzanine role and then eventually quickly went on to become chief secretary of the state. The commissioner of Bangalore, for example, is an ACS level officer. They, on an average, they only have 5 years out of their career of roughly 25 years of experience, 25, 30 years of experience. They spend only on an average 5 years in any urban department. And we've looked at this with, some latitude. We've given them some, you could say some leeway while assessing this. And similarly, if you look at the average tenure, Dr. JP spoke about the, cities like Raipur. If you look at cities in the range of 1 to 5 million, their average number of commissioners is more than 4 in 5 years. And if you look at large cities, typically close to 3 years is the maximum tenure. And I want to say a few years ago, we invited the manager of the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, which is a metropolitan formation around Manchester. He was a citizen of Manchester, and he was in that in the Manchester City Corporation, by whatever name it's called, for 20 years. And he had occupied the position of the chief executive of that authority for more than 7 years. So continuity, institutional continuity is an imperative for institution building. Unfortunately, I must say that even many senior leaders in the administration in India come to believe that growing roots is actually not good because of chances of vested interest and so on. But that's not a good enough excuse for us to allow for really ridiculously short tenures. Institution building does not happen in that manner. Next. There's an interesting trend if you see in the LHS table. So we've seen that there is an asymmetry between devolution and capabilities that we are noticing, right? Some of the cities in states like Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, etc., went on to reform their municipal acts, unlike some of the more urbanized states, post Gen NURM, after the model municipal law came. And some of them actually have progressive provisions on devolution to cities, but they have very weak capacities. So their cities don't have access to revenue streams or to staff. On the other hand, you look at the larger cities of Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore, etc. They all have ridiculously short tenures for mayors. So the mayors in Delhi and Bangalore have terms of 1 year each, and Mumbai also has less than 3 years. But they have relatively better capacities, both on financing and staffing. And I would like to believe this is by design, right? But by and large, my own engagement with many of these states seem to indicate to me that the urbanizing states of, the states that I named earlier, Madhya Pradesh and Uttar Pradesh, etc., may actually be more willing than, fairly settled states of Maharashtra, Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, etc., to undertake radical reforms in urban decentralization. This is, of course, anecdotal hypothesis based on my own experience over the last 2-3 years. Next. So transparency and citizen participation. There are no platforms for participation in India cities. Area sabhas at a polling booth level, which are roughly analogous to gram sabhas, do not exist, despite Nagar Raj bill, and ward committees are also dysfunctional pretty much across the board. Next. Therefore, the bottom line, we believe the 5 levers for transformative change in India are spatial plans and design standards, fiscal decentralization and robust financial management systems, municipal staffing reforms, not just municipal cadre, but overhaul in municipal staffing, empowered mayors and councils, and formal platforms for citizen participation. I mean, this is basically the what. I'll quickly run you through a set of reforms that we believe are required to the Constitution and to state municipal acts. I'll only read out the headlines in about 2 minutes, and then I want to spend 3-4 minutes on the how to break the status quo part of it. Next. We can skip this actually. Next. Fixed reservation system for mayoral position. Dr. JP has already covered it, so I'm going to skip it. The second point is the importance of fixed tenure of 5 years for mayors. This is quite important. Irrespective of whether the mayor is directly elected or indirectly elected, it's important that to make it a politically important position, in addition to the amendment to reservation and rotation, there also needs to be a stable tenure of at least 5 years. Some states like MP, etc., have already got that provision actually. Devolution of profession tax. it stands out as a one-off provision, but profession tax can actually be a buoyant source of revenue. Currently, it's limited by a constitutional provision, so that provision needs to be amended to lift the limit of 2,500 rupees per annum. Next. Constitution of ward committees and also metropolitan planning committees and DPCs. This point number 6 is on state finance commissions to strengthen them. It's extremely important that SFCs function in a legitimate manner to result in predictable streams of fiscal transfers to cities. So as far as revenues are concerned, more than whether the revenue is owned by the city, what is more important is predictability. Predictability over at least a 5-year term. London, for example, does not earn most of its revenue by itself, but it does have a formal agreement with the federal government whereby there is 100% predictability and visibility over the transfers that will happen from the federal government over a 5-year term. Next. Strengthening the role of the State Election Commission, particularly around maintenance of electoral rolls, delimitation, reservation rotation, etc. There's also the fact that some of the councils provide for MPs, MLAs to have voting rights. Next. There is a may versus shall question, which many of the old guard of the 74th Amendment and around those agendas are very familiar with. So that needs to be addressed sooner than later. We have to address the issue of fragmentation, make sure that all 12 functions are devolved to the city. And then there's been an old pending agenda of separate local bodies list, etc. Next. Then simultaneously, even as we...
shall we take the how part later? The how to go about it part, shall we take it up later? Because we have to listen to both Dr. Ahmad and Yamini, and then we have to go to question answer session.
Sure.
Okay. Go on. Quickly summarize the 6 points, and then
actually, what I'll do is I'll stop with these provisions and spend a couple of minutes on the how part, Dr. JP, because that is important. I'm sandwiched between the 3 of you on one side and the 2 of them on the other side, but I want to make a couple of important points.
There's a surfeit of expertise today.
Sorry?
There's a surfeit of expertise today, sir.
There is but there is also a need to actually break from the past, which I think is important, and a new guard that needs to emerge has to bear in mind that the political economy has changed gradually but definitively over the last 5 to 10 years. So there are 2 things that are emerging, and I think we need to operate on how to break the status quo in 2 tracks. Even as we look at COVID-19 as an opportunity, I'm frankly not holding my breath for it. I'm not extremely sanguine that something dramatic is going to happen because of COVID, because governments are going to be preoccupied by solving for COVID to begin with and then fixing the economy for some time to come. What is important is for us to operate on 2 tracks. One is a long-term 15-year track, where we basically consider the 74th Constitution Amendment practically buried, where we invent a new grammar which pushes for public participation for the same agendas, but with a new grammar. Because I think there's been a definitive shift towards strong political leaders, a hollowing out of elected leaders in the urban democratic setup, where strong chief ministers are working with a limited executive of bureaucrats in the CMO and select bureaucrats that they trust to implement either large infrastructure projects, metros, ring roads, large projects, or direct benefits to the socioeconomically disadvantaged by using technology or large schemes and missions. So one track is a 15-year track where we brace ourselves to ride on big agendas like climate change, public safety and women, jobs and economy, and rising aspirations of the youth, and water and sanitation, pressing issues which are impacting lives of the urban poor and the urban classes directly. Ride on those issues, connect the governance agenda to them more directly. Secondly, engage in a set of tactical interventions with government, because they are looking out for implementation support. So help them fix the tactical pieces where they have felt needs. It could be on property taxation, it could be on fixing finances, etc., or technology. Technology and finances appear to be the 2 most pressing requirements that they have. But more importantly, the socio-economic composition of the political leadership and the administration has changed over the last 15 years. It is no longer a case where, within quotes, people like us can find people like us on the other side of the table. Increasingly, you will find that people on the other side of the table in the political system and the administration are people from a different socioeconomic setup who may not speak the language that we are used to over the last 5 to 10 years. But they are people with their ear to the ground. They understand the realities on the ground probably better than we do. And therefore, we need to change our grammar from a technocratic governance theoretical grammar to something that is more realistic and speaks to them in their language. And therefore, public mobilization in cities will have to happen differently and in a more broad-based manner than happen in in limited groups of people who pat each other's backs and who tend to agree with each other and find their kindred spirit on the other side of the table. So I'll close with this.
Thank you, Srikanth. Very insightful presentations. I only wish we had more time. We have with us Dr. Ahmad. He's not only a person with enormous expertise at his disposal, because the World Bank has done immense studies all over the world, but personally, he has been a very serious student and scholar of the urban governments across the world, the developed countries, countries of South Africa, and then of course South Asia and elsewhere. Dr. Ahmad, your comments and your reflections.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. I have to admit that over the years, as I've been thinking about the urban story of India, I feel like a character in Samuel Beckett's play, Waiting for Godot. Somewhere, something will happen. And just like the protagonists, Vladimir and Estragon, what you find is neither of them are able to, at the end of the day, define exactly who is Godot. And at the end, we don't quite know when Godot will arrive, regardless of what it is. And I began my engagement on urban through very technical issues. And I've now come a full 160 degrees the other side. And I now belong fully in, I must say, in Ramesh's school of thought. I think we need to figure out what are the political drivers of change in the urban sector. I think we need to bring a different set of thinkers, academics, practitioners, to ask them to put different types of scenarios of where they think the urban system will go. What Ramesh did, reflecting on Srikanth and Swati's points, he talked about his view of a group of people, 20-25%, and how do you support them to really hit the 50%. That's a important political economy thought process about how change happens. I think we need to bring in more disciplines into asking this question. I think the technical aspects, devolution, fiscal, finance, and so on, we kind of understand. But what we don't understand is the political economy process here. And I think that your bringing together of this storyline was whether crisis is an important entry point into political change. And listening to the presentation so far, it's a mixed reaction. Perhaps not. But then, what are these drivers of change? And I think my first point will be that we need to do far more analysis of this point. My second shift over the years is I focused a lot on cities and city management, and I didn't spend enough time understanding India's federalism, the relation between the center and the state. The presentation by Swati and colleagues make a very important point that there are some states whose political economy will be very different than other states in moving forward the urban story. If that's true, then probably one of the safest bet we can take is how do we get India to truly implement its federalism? Let the states truly own this country. Let the powers shift to the state And I think in that process, there will be certain states that will gravitate towards the third tier and drive the third tier. And that leads to my third point that I've come to the conclusion is that the center cannot drive urban reform. I saw the evolution of JNNURM, and I have to say it's lack of success. I'm watching the evolution of smart cities and other programs in the current storyline, and I'm not seeing that it's opening up the stories. So I think that overall there is a real need for us who recognize the importance of urban to spend far more time on the political economy of urban scenarios and the role of federalism in that story, and to, I think, be very strong in suggesting to Government of India, stop your centrally sponsored schemes to cities. It is actually working contrary to the strengthening of the cities. Now that may seem ironic, but I think that's my read of the story. And then I think the fourth point is we have to build a far greater coalition with the finance commissions. In particular, the 15th Finance Commission, which I think has taken on the baton of how to engage in the third tier. And I think we have to engage there because they hold a lot of resources, and the way they would deliver the resources to the cities may be very different than what a centrally sponsored scheme would do. I think that's a very important player to bring on board. Having said that, I think all of you are right that we have to find the cracks in the wall and grab those cracks. So what could they be? I think COVID absolutely offers them if we can grab them. And I think everyone is recognizing that unlocking India means unlocking urban India. And if unlocking urban India is the point, you have to engage in an urban municipal health system, which can go neighborhood by neighborhood, that can engage with the citizens, that can talk about community surveillance, about community testing, about isolating the hotspots. That cannot be done at the state level and certainly not at the central level. It has to be done on the city level. And this is where I think the potential of partnership between city managements as they exist, even in their weak stage, and the state government may open up the story of a municipal cadre here that deals with public health. Because going forward, whether it's communicable diseases or what's becoming very important already in India, non-communicable diseases, and especially in the southern states, both require huge behavior change on citizens' part, which means that the interface between the lowest tier of government and citizens is where the story of health will come in a very important way. So I think there is a real potential here. That leads me to, I think, the point that all of you have mentioned, and JP, you have mentioned, is rethinking the municipal cadre. You did a brilliant job in showing the mayor's role in different parts of the world. China, interestingly, is not a mayor-led story, but a state manager-led story. But a state manager is part of the cadre. But the commonality between a state manager and a mayor is both of them are responsible for the city as an integrated system. So how do we get India to think about a state manager? And I think that state governments would be far more interested in thinking about a state manager rather than the political economy of mayors. Though again, federalism would play out in different ways, but I think there's a real scope of reimagining the municipal commissioner, given all the faults that Srikanth, Ramesh, and Swati have pointed out there, and you have pointed out. I think there's a real role there to be played. I think that's one important. Second element of the COVID, not only health, but social protection. And what we are recognizing is the informal economy the small and medium enterprise. This is an urban-based workforce that doesn't have the protection that rural India has in terms of social protection. And to get social protection to this group will require a partnership between the center, the state, and the local. The last mile delivery for informal sector and MSME is a huge entry point that I think we can bring municipal cadres and the municipal government into a stronger focus. The other area is service delivery. And in service delivery, I am coming to the conclusion that the political economy role that we thought of local governments, urban big city governments owning the service delivery, doing the service delivery, not sure the politics will enable that. But what the politics can enable is corporatization of service delivery. So a water utility, a solid waste utility, a roads agency or a roads authority, corporatizing these so that they can go into capital markets to borrow and letting them have a better chance at lifting user charges changes the nature of the service delivery. But mind you, it's not about empowering citizens, it's empowering beneficiaries. And there's a difference between the two, right? A corporate body seeks beneficiaries, seeks client, they don't seek citizens. So this is not an optimal story, but it is a story that I think can move forward service delivery in a very different dimension. And in terms of finance, I think it is absolutely true. If one could put a more of a predictability on finance for the third tier, it'll change it'll have a very different change in terms of the politics. And here I belong to the Kelker school of thought, where he said, give 1, if not 2% of GST to the cities. Let the cities have that portion of GST, and that's it. And then let's walk away from the story. Let that be predictable. Now, having said that, how GST money has flown from the center to the state, if that's any prediction of that's a prediction of how the future would work for cities, then it's not a great story. I must admit, related to federalism, is I wonder. Well, let me say, under no circumstances do I see the United States ever going to a VAT or a GST, because no state government will ever give up their ability to have their own tax administration and do their own taxation, even though it means 56 states having 56 tax administration is inefficient. And I think that the story of the GST Council, until it truly works, proves what the US political economy will never give up, which is states having their powers. So bottom line, my sort of years of working on urban in India has led me to believe that we have to pay far more attention to political economy scenarios and understand them in order to see where we go. I have now recalibrated my thinking to ask the question, how do we strengthen federalism? Because I believe that's the route to a third tier. And I think the third sort of reflection is, I too believe there are important cracks in the system. COVID offers it, and we can enter it from the point of view of the municipal health, social protection, and service delivery. And the final point, which I must say, the two groups that you have invited here, Srikanth, Ramesh, and Swati, and Janaagraha, and Yamini, CPR. Over the years, watching these two groups, the amount of knowledge that they have built from ground up, and how your group is playing a role of bringing this kind of knowledge to the table, I think is such an important platform for India. How we can leverage this knowledge platform, because it's not a passive knowledge platform. All of you are active thinking practitioners. how we use this knowledge group to really take forward the reform process within government, I think is a challenge, at least for us multilaterals. And I think we haven't paid enough due to this partnership. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmad, particularly for focusing attention on the key issue, federalism. Just to extend the point, there is no federal country in the world except Canada where the federal constitution decides the state's governance structure. India is the only exception. And there is no federal constitution in the world where the local government structure is decided by the constitution. India is the lone exception in the world. We are taking it for granted as if it's normal. It's absolutely abnormal. I think somehow we have to educate ourselves and the people that matter in the country. Yamini, with everybody's consent, we will extend the Q&A session by another half an hour because we lost some time. There are a lot of eager, bright, young urbanites who are very keen to participate. Yamini.
Thank you, Dr. JP, for giving me the opportunity to come here and be part of this very important discussion. But you've also put me in a very awkward spot because you brought me in after I have heard from everybody from whom I've learned. And so now I'm going to have to find some way of trying to say something right at the end when all that must be said has already been said. But what I'll try and do perhaps is to build on, I think, one of the most important areas of consensus that I think are emerging out of this conversation, which is something that I feel in debates on decentralization, whether it is urban or rural, we don't talk about enough, which is around the need to build a political consensus and to find the opportunity to actually break through from the technocratic conversations that we have always had about what it means to do decentralization right, to actually getting decentralization done. And I think that in the early decades, I guess, after the 73rd and 74th Amendment, a lot of time and effort was spent, including political capital, thinking through what that technocratic architecture of local governments should look like in India. So we assumed that this was actually a process of administrative slicing and dicing. So we talked about the 3 Fs as a sort of mantra. And in fact, the first task I did when I came into the World Bank and when I first met Junaid was exactly this. I mean, we have these beautiful matrices that will apply every single first principle of public finance economics, which is where I learned my economics actually, into level by level of which level of government should do what. And we've had this. Janaagraha has built even more sophisticated and far better models of exactly how to do this. We've always got stuck on the question of how does one then take these models and actually get them implemented. And I think one of the things that we have forgotten in the conversations about local governance in India is that just as we were trying to administratively decentralize, we were also going through a very crucial moment of political centralization. Every single political party, regional or national, in fact, doesn't create a political incentive structure for the sarpanch to the mayor to then eventually become prime minister. The structure of our political parties do not function in that way, and they did in the past. So when I saw your listing of all those from Jawaharlal Nehru onward who have spent time cutting their teeth in local governments, the first question I asked myself was not how empowered the municipality or the local government or the panchayat is. The first question I asked myself was, what is it about the Congress party and the BJP that actually doesn't empower its own local architecture in order for, and I think until political parties do not see local governments as important training grounds for future politicians, we will never be able to move the envelope. So I think a very important constituency that we do not speak to enough. When we go to political parties, we always go to those who have already bought into the idea of local governance. And all the others that we talk to usually will say, oh, I'm not going to give, they're all corrupted. I'm not going to have that conversation. We need to find a new vocabulary that actually brings in the core political discourse. Why do we not have enough political scientists who study political party competition in conversations about decentralization, when they tell us a lot more about what has changed in political party dynamics that have meant that local cadres of political parties, that are the ones that engage at the panchayat and the municipality level, actually then create career trajectories within our political structures. The second thing I feel that we don't think about hard enough is, Junaid rightly said, we need to be thinking about decentralization or urban governance in the context of federalism. But when we think about federalism, in fact, the state governments, the political architecture at the state level has a very crucial role that they play in bargaining with the center. Even the GST took decades to come into play because states were bargaining. They recognize how important it is to hold their territory, to hold on to the financial devolution that is theirs to take from the center, and they fight hard to get it. There is an institutional space which is now closing off, but it existed in different ways and forms, and the Finance Commission continues actually to play that role. And states see it, this is part of how states play their politics. This does not happen at the state level. Nowhere will you see these, even Karnataka that has unions of Zilla Parishad members and at the urban level, do you see this kind of mobilization where in fact asking for greater fiscal devolution, which is the constitutional right of local governments, becomes part of the political discourse. And that, I think, one important part of that is that there is, as all the presenters before and everything that we know about urban governance reminds us, the complexity of our public finance architecture and its lack of transparency means that for the most part, and I know this a lot more in the rural context, but or from learning from all of you who work on local urban governance, it seems to me that it's not so different. We actually have very little transparency and very little understanding of the structure of municipal financing and local and rural local governance financing, which then makes it much harder for the local elected representatives to actually use this as a tool for engaging in a political bargaining with the states. No matter what the Finance Commission will do in New Delhi, until the State Finance Commission doesn't operate as a serious key institution of public finance at the state level, we will not see real decentralization or devolution. And that will only occur when local politics changes. And that is where I think a lot more needs to be done. And here I think there are technocratic solutions. And we are now entering a world where all financial management of government is done, is all computerized. Technology can enable a lot more transparency in local government financing. And I think Janaagraha has taken such an important lead in this direction. More needs to be done across the country in making public finances for local governance a lot more transparent and a lot more accessible and available to elected representatives to be able to use as a critical tool in their engagement. Because until municipalities, Zilla Parishads and Panchayats do not demand that the SFC actually does its job and that what the SFC says it's going to do gets implemented, we will not have robust local governance in India, whether rural or urban. Just like at the center, if the government doesn't set up a finance commission every 5 years, and if the recommendations of the finance commission aren't accepted by government, you see an uproar. I mean, even the terms of reference of the 15th Finance Commission caused deep political mobilization across the country. That's where we need to get to. And I think transparency of finances could well be, and there's enough ways of doing this without actually ruffling up any feathers, which I feel is an opportunity that we are not engaging with enough. The third thing I wanted to say is, as much as we're talking about big city governance, we also know that most urbanization that is taking place in India is taking place in our smaller towns, cities, what we are now calling rurban. And I wonder if that rurban, we've been talking about the fact that a lot of cities, census towns are still being governed by rural panchayats. But I wonder if this is an opportunity for us to think very differently about regional governance. A lot of our local governance institutions, both at the panchayats and the municipalities, are in some ways now, after 25 years, 27 years, entrenched in a particular way of functioning. And I think that maybe the real disruptor could be thinking differently about the organization of the governance institutions, which bring in all that we have learned from the experiences of these last 27 years into addressing this space, because there's a vacuum here and it needs to be very, very urgently filled. There's an opportunity to think about fiscal devolution here differently, to think about taxation here differently. The economies of these regions of these small towns and cities are still evolving and emerging, and they are going to be crucial. I mean, more economic activity takes place in these census towns and cities than in big cities. However, productivity, of course, is a different story altogether. So I don't really have the answers, but I do want to say that we need to insert this back, this sort of new space, and not fall into the trap, I think, which I feel central government is pushing, that urban is about convergence of schemes and sort of replicating the municipal structure that exists in our cities and towns. And if we do that, we are going to miss a huge opportunity to really try and change the status quo in an important way. I completely concur with what Junaid was saying on the predictability of financing. And I do think that a percentage share of GST to local governments, rural and urban, is the right way to go. However, as we're thinking about taxation, I think it's also important for us to keep in mind the fact that, frankly, for the next 10 years, the revenue share at the fiscal space at the central government level is shrinking, and shrinking really badly. It has expanded its expenditure ambition hugely across political parties. Its revenue raising capabilities have been consistently low, and it has consistently budgeted now at becoming a pattern in a way that it projects much higher than it actually collects, and that causes complete chaos all through the system. And the challenges we are seeing with GST are very much going to be part of that. I think that GST will also require there is going to have to be some change in how GST itself operates. And that could well be the opportunity to start bringing in the conversation on local governance in that space, even as we push harder about the fact that local governments are not good enough, and states, about property taxes and other taxes that are within its power. The last thing that I will say on this is that, we're talking about crisis and opportunities, and I think COVID has been discussed quite a lot as in terms of the opportunities it presents. There's just one other crucial opportunity that I think we shouldn't forget, at least in the context of big cities, which is air pollution. And again, especially because there is a huge elite consensus around the need to tackle air pollution. I frankly find those conversations deeply frustrating, because I fear that elite consensus is getting us into a place where we are privatizing our air, and at that point, all governance and democracy is over. But we've gotten there in Delhi, so certainly. However, other large cities too are grappling with this. And the only way that you can really genuinely tackle a challenge like air pollution is through much more coordinated and robust local governance. I mean, there's just no other way of doing this. So and it's quite shocking to me that local governance is not as much a part of this debate on air pollution. Every year when Delhi starts getting gray and you can't see outside of your homes, we start talking about interstate issues and farm burning and so on. That's when all of us should collectively be inserting a much more robust conversation on local governments and municipalities. I think as a community, we're not doing that enough. The reason we're not doing that enough is because there just aren't enough of us. The numbers of people that are talking about local governance in India is a shrinking, not an expanding pool. And I think both on the research side as well as on the activist side, this gap is something that we should be really concerned about. So how do we create more platforms to bring more into this discussion than it being all of us who've been talking to each other for many years now, not perhaps as frequently as we should. But the fact that there aren't others is something that it should deeply concern us. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Yamini. You're absolutely right. It's not a very sexy subject. In fact, most of the elites, not only in government, but those outside, they're very skeptical of local governments. The middle classes in India, they're very hostile. So your point is valid, but maybe cities will offer a better opportunity because people feel that they're paying taxes and they're not getting just rewards for that. Q&A, Sweta, let's move to that.
Okay, so we'll start off with the Q&A. Thank you, speakers, for such a constructive engagement. Our first question is from Mr. Keshav to Dr. Junaid Ahmad. So, in your experience, which exemplary large cities of developing countries in the post-1990 era have seen dramatic transformation by rapidly providing civic amenities like housing, water, electricity, and sanitation to the urban poor? Can some elements of these success stories be emulated in India? Over to you, sir.
Dr. Ahmad, developing societies, success stories in urban governance.
So interestingly, I think that while people look at Latin America as examples, middle income, cities, service delivery, my own experience has been that African cities are actually ahead of the game. Whether you look at Uganda, which actually started the whole story of local government reforms and strengthening of the cities, all the way to South Africa, which basically, South Africa is a country that 75% of GDP comes from about 8 or 9 big cities. And what they've done is in the democratization of South Africa, as apartheid was destroyed, its constitution was written in a way that makes it not, that introduces the word spheres of government, not tiers of government. So the third sphere of government, local government, and within local government, city governments being a separate constitutional body, very strong mayors, very strong city managers, responsibility of service delivery completely in the hands of the cities, different cities choosing to deliver services in different ways. And interestingly, central government, in particular Ministry of Finance, every quarter brings all the treasurers of the big cities together to meet with the finance secretary, because they recognize that the growth and financial aspects of the country will be driven by what these cities do. It's a very, very different, different model. Now, interestingly, South Africa is not 100% directly elected mayors. It's an indirect election because it goes back to how the Constitution was written to bring in inclusion of all the different racial groups to move towards a new South Africa. And so what they decided was that a group that could even get 5% of the vote would have representation in the interim government. And then going forward, basically what they've done is they've gone for indirect elections. So ANC will say, here are my top 30 people that will run for Johannesburg. DP will say, here are my 25 top people who run for Cape Town. So there, you're not electing an individual, you're electing a party, right? And that is an interesting weakness of the system, because it gives the party tremendous control over the mayor and the others. The constituency-based, what Janaagraha was talking about, a whole constituency ward-based elections then don't happen, and you lose that kind of if you will, accountability. But I would look to many of the African cities. You know, more African cities have 24/7 drinking water than any in South Asia. And we're talking about Burkina Faso, we're talking about Swaziland, we're talking about Sierra Leone. These are places where cities will deliver continuous supply of water because they've created corporatized, municipal-owned service provider, a very different model than state-owned agencies or public agencies as they are in South Asia, not only in India. So a quick answer is I would look to Africa, even though one would easily look to some places in East Asia, look to some places in Latin America.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmad. Next question, Preeti.
Yes, sir. Next question is from Mr. Samroj to Ms. Yamini Aiyar. Will development of city-like infrastructure and amenities in rural areas prove to be a long-term solution to long-distance migration of laborers in search of employment? With better opportunities closer, there would not be a need to travel far for work. Ma'am.
Thanks for this question. It's an important one, but I'm not sure how best to answer this. I can't speak for why people migrate. There are multiple reasons. Economic distress is only one part of it. There are also many other factors, including aspirations, that come into play. But none of this changes the fact that we absolutely need to do two very crucial things. One, we need to be thinking very differently about our economy in a way that doesn't find itself locked into binaries and doesn't recognize that a lot of investment has to be made, particularly in this transition between rural to urban, that it's a continuum and there isn't something called rural that starts and stops and urban that starts and begins. And that investment in that continuum is about a holistic investment of creating the kind of infrastructure you need to build a robust economy. And that will certainly help in addressing distress migration. And secondly, for migration that comes to cities. And I think that we can't let the real crisis that needs to be turned into an opportunity is a crisis, what we're calling the migrant crisis, that we have to turn into an opportunity that recognizes that labor moves in India. India has a national labor market, and that labor market needs to be adequately protected. So the portability of our entitlements and benefits that, as Junaid said, tended to be very much focused regionally and specifically in rural, that need to come into the urban. So the social protection in urban has to be a very crucial part of our debate, and that includes thinking about how we address issues of portability and also therefore how we do fiscal devolution in that context. And also, and I think it was brought up in Dr. Narayan's presentation as well, the question of urban housing. Ultimately, if we want, people need to move in India. People are the drivers of our economy. In fact, India is a unique place where, given the point at which we are in our economic trajectory, we don't have as much mobility of labor as we should have. And this needs to be what we need to do is to ensure that this is well protected, that people have access to basic social protection, that people can live in dignity, and people can go to work wherever they choose to go to work.
Just a follow-up question to this, ma'am, if you have time.
Sure. I'm sorry, I had another meeting, so I am going to have to leave soon, but I'm happy to take another question.
Priti, I think before Yamini leaves, now ask her a bunch of questions so that we can take the advantage of her time.
Sure. So, ma'am, can you think of any examples of cities where large number of people from slum dwellings moved to home ownership with minimal amount of burden on taxpayers, or any intervention of sorts by politicians?
Any intervention of?
Any interventions by politicians?
Honestly, I'm not qualified to answer that question, the question on housing. I don't know enough about urban housing to be able to answer that well. I know that Mumbai had experimented quite a lot with different ways of addressing this problem, but it's not something that I would be the right person to answer. So I'm going to skip that one. If you have another, I'm happy to take it on.
One question is on direct election of mayor. We have seen that 6 states practiced direct election of mayor. However, it was not of much success. What were the limiting factors to it, and what could be the way forward?
So to me, as I said in my remarks, I think the biggest limiting factor in all of this is that we have a political party structure that is now so centralized that really the way in which political competition internally works is very much about how and who enters the top structure. And so we don't have enough incentives in how political parties are organized for these, for active and effective political participation at the municipality or the local government level. And I think until we are not able to adequately engage in that, all the kinds of changes that we make in terms of how elections take place, etc., will not fundamentally change who chooses to stand for election and how they best utilize their powers to be able to both aggregate a mass political base as well as build their political careers to rise within the political structure. So we'll never have a Boris Johnson become Prime Minister in India because of the architecture of our political parties. That has to change along with, and when you see that, you'll automatically see a much greater constituency for more allocation of powers and resources to local governments.
Just to add to that point, Yamini is absolutely right. Unless the political party structure allows the rise of leadership from the grassroots, there's no way you can really empower local governments or allow political recruitment of a different kind. But if you elect a cipher through direct election, how does it matter? Hyderabad city had a direct election of a mayor long ago, I think way back in 2003 or 2004, maybe even earlier, I think 96, 97, 98. Then the districts in Andhra Pradesh during NTR's time had a direct election of the Zilla Parishad chairperson. That's the only case in India in 1987. All ZP chairpersons in districts with 3 million, 5 million population directly elected the Zilla Parishad chairperson. Now that may give some kind of visibility, but if the power itself is denied, they are reduced to a phone, a car, a light, and a peon. This is more or less the limit of the power of the local governments, and perhaps in many cases, ministers also in states, and increasingly perhaps in the union. Then doesn't matter the manner of election. I would actually argue that in the Indian context, given the representational problems and the reservations, it may also make sense to have an indirect election as long as the mayor is empowered. Because then without a mayor's office being reserved to a particular category, the large sections are elected as councillors who represent the marginalized sections will automatically form a majority. They can choose somebody who is sympathetic to their point of view. But in a natural, organic political way rather than an artificial way restricting the field of election. So I don't think direct versus indirect is a big issue. Empowerment and elegantly designing in a manner that they can actually deliver is far more important. And of course, political parties, the way they're altered. The reason why I don't talk much about it is we're talking to political parties to change things. To tell them that we're all useless doesn't really give us entry, and it doesn't really change things. So sometimes we have to reduce our demands. We have to be much more humble. There's no other choice.
Absolutely, I agree. Thank you so much, and I apologize again for having to leave, but I'd long committed to a meeting this today at 6 o'clock, so I do have to run. And thanks for bringing me back with old friends. Thanks.
I'm constrained, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for joining, ma'am. Thank you.
Sweta?
Unfortunately, may I also request, because I have a 6 o'clock, I didn't expect that it would go beyond that. So I'm so sorry, JP, but can I please, and Srikanth, can I please also excuse myself?
Will you give 5 minutes, Sweta, so that there are a couple of questions I think addressed to you?
Okay.
Yes, Mrs. Swati, if you could give us a couple of minutes. And, yeah.
Okay.
So, ma'am, there's one question from Harsha to you. So the planning, finances, and roadmap for urban transformation is executed through centrally sponsored schemes like Amrut. Vizag, for example, is dependent financially on Amrut, defined by the government. So given the large dependency on union government and tangible success, is this the right mechanism in the long run?
My response is I'm actually doing, the Amrut master plans for 3 towns in Tamil Nadu, Tanjavur and Pudukkottai and Kumbakonam. My response is that Amrut is actually, has actually embarked upon the planning part of it, whereas Smart Cities was the scheme for the development part of it. I also did Smart Cities in Bengaluru, and I should say that there are so many issues with both the schemes. But let me stick to Amrut. In Amrut, I think part of the challenge is the movement, and I think now COVID has put a complete halt to it. But the centralized kind of embarking of doing master plans for the cities under Amrut, essentially it is just to create some kind of a standardization of all the maps. And the good thing that's coming out in just these Amrut related cities is they have created a standardized geodatabase in which central government is now actually taking all the data, making the, the consultants actually go down, the people who are doing the master plans do a ground truthing and a verification. But nothing has changed in what, we talked about in terms of how master plans are prepared or what is the, thinking of it. It's still a very standardized and old world kind of a methodology of preparing plans. So that's as far as what was your specific, what was the specific question on Amrut?
So the question was that there are a lot of schemes, centrally sponsored schemes like Amrut, that a lot of the governments are reliant on. So we're talking about decentralization. So how can we move away from such centrally sponsored schemes to more localized governance?
In fact, Junaid made the point that we must give up CSS for the cities. Perhaps you can transfer that as a bulk grant, but Swati?
Yeah, I think so. I think that, essentially to the schemes which were, again, JNNURM also was faulty, was to allow the kind of freedom and flexibility and let them learn to either sink or swim, but let it be on their, it's on their merit, right? It's on their thing, and the people will hold them accountable. So there are many things that have to come together for accountability. So therefore, participation and platforms for the people. But ultimately, if we do want to decentralize, we want to allow those 18 functions that urban has, they must be allowed to actually take this forward, which they are also. In Amrut's case, at least, I think it's not too much of a big brother kind of imposing. The scheme literally makes sure that the city has a plan. It's primarily, my instinct is, in the case of Amrut at least, the intention is to create a standardized geodatabase and have all the data from these cities, which is standardized and centralized and then shared. In some ways, if the states do the right thing, then they can create a spatial data center, which then creates the kind of different agencies creating their own spatial data creates greater schizophrenia, because you can't map everything together. So data being one of the big gaps in our cities, access to data, good quality data, is one of the big things. So I think to that extent, Amrut is a good thing if it actually collects all this data and creates a standardized database and then makes it available to all the states and the cities. So, but otherwise, I think the point is absolutely, you need to devolve. And if you want to empower cities, then you can't then be imposing schemes from the center.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, ma'am. Do you have to leave now, or can you take a couple of questions?
I can take one more. Go ahead.
Okay, so there's one from Shrija. Megacities are exalted by virtue of the contribution they make to the national and state economy. However, this often happens at the cost of the environment and equity. Do you think going for decentralized urbanization, that is smaller cities but more in number, is a better strategy?
Well, it's as, Dr. JP said, you can't put the genie back in the bottle and there's no stopping it. So we can't say that, we're not a China model, right? So we are not going to say that so many and no more. So who do we allow into our cities and who not? And what do we do with the existing mega cities? So but I do take the point that both the environment and, taking care of some of the affordable housing, etc. The government just has to plan better, and that's make the allocations, a whole bunch of things again that come into play, which is how do you create the impetus for both the budgetary impetus, as well as the proper planning of it in making sure that these mega cities actually tackle their issues of affordable housing and provide this. Currently, there is no. So many states have the affordable housing, the PMAY has come in, but they're of such shoddy implementation, and so many of them haven't taken off. So in terms of affordable housing and in terms of environment, again, a lot of it is to do with planning, because you can get into a micro detail, into a redevelopment kind of an issue in a mega city. But if you take a macro issue on pollution, on water, on soil, on all of this, then how do you actually protect the environment? Those are all big challenges of the big cities. And I don't think there are any simple silver bullets to address these.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Swati.
Thank you so much. It was fantastic. It was lovely being part of this, and I'll catch up with the rest of it later. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. So there's one question from Mithul to Dr. Junaid. Dr. Junaid, you yourself or anybody else can take it up. So we've spoken about the fact that GST has subsumed most local taxes. So going by global practices, what would be other sources of revenue for local governments in India? And can issuing municipal bonds be a solution?
I have to request Srikanth to come in. If there's anyone that I would trust in this analysis, it's Srikanth. Srikanth, maybe you can lead us in the discussion.
But before that, Dr. Ahmad, from your experience all over the world, are there some innovative taxes possible at the local? Right now, except property tax, there's nothing really significant in the city.
So what we are seeing is first, deepen the property tax. Second, capture land valuation. As development happens, land prices are going up, capture that evaluation. Third is there a whole set of environmental taxes that are emerging that can be tapped. I stay away from commercial business taxes because that I think creates a lot of distortions. But on the others, I think that's the way I would. And then depending on the nature of service delivery, you have to let user charges finance a lot of service delivery, not as a tax for general budget, but really to finance the delivery of services. That takes off the burden on general taxation, feeding service delivery. And municipal bonds, absolutely, municipal bonds have to be the way of the future, but that will depend on the cities themselves having the creditworthiness writ large, that there is a local tax base, that there is accountability, that there is a bankruptcy framework around the raising of money. Otherwise, this lending is seen as being a contingent liability of state or central government. So there's a whole framework there that can be easily developed.
Thank you. Srikanth, would you like to come in now?
Yeah, so in the chat window, I'd exactly responded with this to Mitul, that I think more than innovation, what we need to do is to get the fundamentals right, particularly on property taxation and optimizing return on land and property. And the third piece I would re-emphasize on is on predictability of fiscal transfers, which is we seem to only focus on the quantum of fiscal transfers, but we also need to focus on predictability. Give them a 5-year window, both from the center and the state. There are too many discretionary grants. So what the state governments are doing is reducing the SFC devolutions and increasing the share of discretionary grants, obviously for political capital. But even if they make it discretionary, if you give 5-year visibility, I think that makes it much better. One additional point I want to say is we generally focus on the revenue side and the expenditure side as independent silos. What is very important in the municipal is what will fund what. What is a good source of funding to fund what expenditure? Taking off from what Junaid said, that for service delivery, certain kinds of service delivery fees may be useful. But, for example, for stormwater drainage, it may be better to, fund it from your own budgetary sources. So this kind of normative standard doesn't exist in India. So there is absolutely no guidance to say for what size of municipalities, for what categories of expenditure, what should be the kind of funding. So looking at revenues and expenditure together is quite important for municipalities and setting some standards and guidelines. We're in fact, as we speak, we're working with the MOHA on something similar over the next 12, 18 months. Yes, Ramesh.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add a piece on this, which is the fact that cities have been financially starved for all these years is actually a possible piece of good news, in the sense that the mistake we should not make is to open up the fiscal wallet to restore parity of comparable margins to, say, other countries and so on, without enforcing a discipline how that money is actually spent. I think one can easily say that the way public money is spent in institutions is substantially worse than how it is done, let's say, in personal households. And there's no reason why we shouldn't enforce very stringent norms of accountability of cities, both outward to the local citizens, as well as call it upwards or laterally to other tiers of government, especially if some of these come through cleverly designed fiscal transfers, let's say from the Central Finance Commission or the State Finance Commission. So there are innovative instruments to do this. For example, in the private sector or in the social change space, there are social impact bonds, where you have investors who are willing to put in money to address social problems, but depending on the impact. So for example, it could be education of children and the fact that a certain percentage of school children in a public school graduated or hit a certain level of academic performance, the cost of that bond will go down. So there is an inbuilt incentive for the public institution to deliver. I think we should not be leery of looking at those kinds of instruments in the context of financing cities, rather than take a blunt view of, say, let's go and unleash municipal bonds. Because I don't think cities are prepared to absorb that kind of money without, as Srikanth had earlier alluded to, the buckets, holes, leaking a lot of that out. And we don't have the capacity at a national level to afford that kind of leakage.
Thank you, sir. Our next question is from Nikita to Ramesh, sir. Home Investment Partnership Program of 1990 in the US, where states and local governments receive federal grants based on relative housing need, which communities then use, often in partnership with local non-profit groups, to fund affordable housing for rent or home partnership or provide direct rental assistance to low-income households. Is this a good approach for India, considering a large proportion of houses that remain vacant?
I think it's certainly a good idea. Junaid will have probably more to say about this, but there's also new variations of it. I think there's opportunity zones now that the Trump administration has done, which despite the fact that it's a Trump initiative, I think has got some merit to it, which is trying to create incentives and mechanisms for regular money to come into areas that clearly are underdeveloped and need some financial kind of inputs. So, but beyond saying it's a good idea, I don't know much more. So let me hand over to Junaid.
Dr. Ahmad?
I actually don't know much about this either, but I have to say two comments on housing. We have underplayed rental housing and overplayed ownership. For poor people, a vibrant rental housing is extremely important, because as jobs move, they need to move. If they've put in money in housing, they're stuck, right? So rental housing is very important, and many of the US programs are aimed at promoting rental housing. And I think that we need to look at that. Having said that, the innovations that we have in India on housing is very interesting. And one particular one that we are partners with the National Housing Bank, is to go through MFIs that are collateralizing informal income, which is extremely important. And a lot of the small merchants, small entrepreneurs are using their informal income to build 1 or 2 extra rooms to their houses, and one or two of them get rented out. It creates a very vibrant rental market, and it creates a very strong community. I think that is something that needs to be looked at. But the housing is, of course, an entry point which is extremely powerful in the rewriting of the urban agglomeration. And here again, there isn't enough linkage between a city's leadership and the housing financiers, and in particular public housing financiers, as to how to move finance in a way that promotes rental housing, that enables informal collateral to be used, that ensures zoning is done in a way that puts people in safe places, not in areas that are prone to floods and so on. So housing is clearly a very important arena. JP, if I could add something very different, something that Ramesh said, which was very interesting, when he said that perhaps the crisis in urban areas is not big enough for it to mobilize everyone. I think that's a statement that deserves a lot of thinking. One aspect to it, which I've discovered across countries, is even under mismanagement urbanization, cities' contribution to the economy continues to grow. So my city, Dhaka, where I was born and grew up, is one of the most chaotic cities in the world. It's run by about 18 agencies owned by 4 central government ministries. And it's chaotic, but it's 30% of the GDP of the country. And I think we haven't done enough work to understand the economics of cities. It's clearly that the disincentives of a city growing hasn't kicked in. somehow cities constantly manage to keep the productivity going, which is why all of us are interested in cities, because this is the goose that lays the golden egg. And if you can protect it even more, it'll have even more benefits. So I think, when Ramesh says that we don't see the crisis, this is a deep statement. And I think part of it can be explained that the cities, by their density, offer a agglomeration economy that's quite powerful. Now, the question is whether pandemics actually will break that densification. And if it does it lower the productivity of cities? Something that we need to look at.
And if I may add, Junaid, politically speaking, the parties believe that the power is through the rural vote, partly because of our democracy, partly because of, in a country like India, the delimitation structure. If you see the urban constituencies, per constituency, the voting population is much larger in urban constituencies because the delimitation is not taking place regularly because of certain constitutional quirks. And therefore, there are assembly constituencies with 15 lakh population in some cities. I myself contested in a constituency for the Loksatta with the largest number of electorate in the country at the time, 32 lakhs or so. And therefore, political parties see the number of people they get elected in an area and give weightage. And somehow, we must somehow bring in the political perspective, that everybody is saying. Yes, Swati.
Our next question is from Ms. Endu to yourself, Dr. JP. It is highly likely to infuriate reserved categories about eliminating reservations from the office of mayor. Concerned about the vote bank, politicians may show reluctance in changing the status quo. How does this roll out?
I think it's a great question. It's probably among all the proposals that came up today, the most thorny proposal, the most difficult proposal in Indian political context. I think the argument can never be against representative legitimacy. That the marginalized sections, the people who did not have adequate voice in the councils of power, they must have those opportunities, cannot be renegotiated. If we limit it only to the mayoral office, and if we allow the majority who are elected to represent the voice of the marginalized sections to actually choose the leader, then I think it's a saleable case. And because we're limiting it only to a few cities, it's a saleable case. We can actually I was attracted while Dr. Ahmad talked about the South African model where there's a slate of candidates of the party, which has a deficiency because there is no direct link between the constituency, the geographic constituency and the representative. And certainly the parties become all powerful. Maybe in Indian context, to deal with the reservation issue, it may be a good idea to look at the party slate rather than the constituency reservation. The slate guaranteeing the representational legitimacy in a proportion that the law dictates or the society demands. Then you can again have leadership. But a constituency choosing a candidate from a very narrow base, only a few people are eligible to contest, and then mayoral office also having reservation is creating chaos. I think nobody can dispute that. This is an illusory reservation. Therefore, I think I would actually be quite willing to look at the South African model in the Indian context. It's not the best model, but we have to look at a pragmatic answer to a very complex challenge. But we have to have leadership of quality. Devara's Earth and many others, they emerged from the backward classes and became major leaders in the country. So there is tremendous leadership, but unless you allow the natural growth of leadership and sustenance, it will die. And that's what's happening in local governments.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. So this question is to the Janaagraha team. So parastatals play an important role in performing and providing specialized works and services in cities. Is it feasible to bring them in under the city's jurisdiction given the constantly evolving nature of their work?
Ramesh, do you want me to take that?
Go ahead.
Okay. So it's an interesting question. There is no one correct model on accountability of parastatals. That's the first thing. Second thing, parastatals by themselves are not bad. It's good to have specialized agencies for specialized functions. The issue is that the parastatal agencies in many cases in the Indian city, and there are 3-4 variations. There are cases of city level parastatals, there are state level parastatals. In some rare cases in Maharashtra and Gujarat, there are parastatal agencies reporting to the municipality. And the fourth variation, you don't call them state parastatals, but they are government departments. who directly deliver services, police being one of them, in some cases the PHED and so on. The issue is the lack of accountability of those parastatal agencies. In some cases, not just to the city, but also to the urban development department of the state. In some, transport corporations, for example, report to the transport department of the state, the police reports to the home department of the state, and so on. So I think there is need for some thinking on a mezzanine solution. I think it would be too radical to have all those agencies be accountable to the mayor. I don't believe that's going to be feasible, at least in the short term. But what will certainly be feasible is to give a right of refusal to the mayor, is to make sure that the mayor, standing committee chairperson, commissioner, etc., are adequately represented and have a power of veto on very important proposals of the parastatal agency. So we need to think through some elegant mezzanine institutional design where direct reporting may not happen immediately, but could happen over the medium term. But in the interim, there is need for direct accountability for performance, certainly. One of the other ways is to upgrade the position of the commissioner of the city to that which is more senior than the CEOs of parastatal agencies, and to ensure that the mayor and standing committee chairperson are represented on the boards of those agencies and so on. So there are the 3-4 things that can be done, but which is more context specific. There's no one size fits all.
If I may jump in for a minute. I like the expression mezzanine institutions, somewhere in between. That's the way things really work. But to make a broader statement, if we claim that we should not be accountable to a democratic elected government because of the specialization, the doctors, the engineers, the lawyers, the architects, the city planners, the 100 others, each is a very specialized occupation. To say that in governing structure, they have to be independent, that they should be functioning autonomously is different. Yeah. But they are unaccountable. They're all alone with themselves. Is absolutely antithetical to democracy in India, because we are totally anti-political in our approach. We allow politics of a sufferance, not because we respect its legitimacy, because somewhere Ambedkar and others said in the constitution there has to be an elected government, we endure it, but we don't really understand what democracy means. Therefore, there is this revulsion of democratic accountability. That does not mean that the mayor or a prime minister or a chief minister is an expert in everything. Nobody is. But that means that the people of India and people of a city have a right to enforce accountability through a certain mechanism, but with a certain rules of the game and certain independent institutions and certain innovative mechanisms, as Srikanth mentioned. I think this point has to be made because we think, no, these Beokoof politicians know nothing. And we know everything, people like us, as Srikanth said, and therefore we must be somehow insulated from the politicians. The word political interference is one of the most commonly touted expression in India's public discourse dealing with politics.
I think Ramesh had wanted to come in on this.
Just quickly, I think that Junaid's earlier comments about what the term he used, corporatization, I think it may not easily be understood. I think this is precisely the context in which he was saying it, which is there are certain technical capabilities that are needed to deliver water supply, sewerage, or public housing, or whatever else. But the institutional form matters, even if they are, let's say, standalone entities, and their method of accountability and ownership by the city matters. So the current institutional form and the accountability are both broken. So the issue is not that they are standalone entities. So this idea of boards, it's like a trust and a society. It's like Swiss cheese. You don't know where it starts and where it ends. So there are better institutional forms. So corporatization, for example, register it under the Companies Act. Let there be shareholders. Let the majority shareholder be the city government. But it gives you the ability to then bring in, technical expertise and not get it saddled only by being staffed by people in government, So those are the flexibilities that emerge without taking away from the very important point that JP made, which is the political accountability must be center plate in any designing of these institutions.
If I can jump in. That's exactly right. You've defined very nicely and described very nicely what I meant by corporatization. I'll give you an example. Shimla, Himachal state Shimla city faced a water crisis. They came to the World Bank and said, we have two problems: not enough water, and second, we have jaundice issues with water. So can you help us fund a new source of water that we can take the water into the city? We turned around and said that a new source of water would still go into a leaking bucket, which is really the problem. You have to rethink the delivery of your distribution system rather than think of putting a bigger pipe into a leaking bucket. So we worked with the state, and basically what happened was the state gave up two of its state level agencies that were responsible for water in Shimla, merged them, made it a municipal corporate body under companies law with a board that reports to the city, and the city's mayor sits on the board on behalf of the city. But then you have non-municipal directors, etc. And the board and the utility then has the independence on operational level. Under the policy set by municipality, the board is the governance mechanism, and the utility now runs on a daily basis, make sure that things are being delivered. And what's important is we think in another year the city will, the utility will be at a stage where they can actually have the credit worthiness to go into the markets to borrow for capital investment. So then you have the market holding it accountable in terms of service delivery. So here, no attempts to make a utility independent of the political system. That would be the wrong way to go, because you'll kill accountability. Markets cannot be the only form of accountability. Markets are an instrument that the political system must use to create accountability for the citizen, right? That's the connection. And I think that all of us come from the background which says we're worried about political interference, but we're not worried about political accountability. We want political accountability. We want politicians involved in the decision making of these service delivery, public service delivery. But it must be done as a politician's accountability to its citizens that it made the right decisions. I think that's where the structure of service delivery should be able to clearly make it transparent as to how the politician interfaces with the service provider. But that's a very important link for representing the citizens, for sure.
So can we take one last question before we wrap things up? Yeah, so this is to everybody on the panel. So Dr. Junaid, you mentioned that China's GDP is growing even during the time of crisis, the COVID crisis. So it is often said that local innovation and competition are key factors in China's success story. So what are the mechanisms that China has in place for them to scale up their local innovations, and can this model be replicated in a country like India?
So there are many things that China does that would be of interest to India, but principle number one is that you can observe other countries, but you have to think hard about what it means to adapt it locally. JP mentioned the South African model, saying that that may not be the perfect model, but has implications for Indian application. So learning from China, fair enough, but understanding how it fits into the Indian context, even more important. So then if you look at the Chinese storyline, there are many things that are very interesting. I think one is the whole management of cities, where the city manager is in charge of all the service providers. So you run the city as an integrated system. Now, India can and the principle here is run the city as an integrated system with clear accountability. Now India can look at it. Is it as municipal commissioners that ought to be strengthened, making them higher level officer, or is it the 74th Amendment? These are the debates that have to happen in the context of bringing things from other countries. I think the other thing that's important, if you look at the China story, is their ability to really move their systems to be export oriented. India, I think, has a lot to do in terms of investing in its logistics systems, infrastructure systems, port authorities, in its systems of customs administration, which will make India far more competitive globally. How to do that, India has to figure out its own path. But what the Chinese did was it chose its path of planning to achieve that. And I guess the third part is China chose a certain management or planning system, if I can borrow Swati's emphasis. India today, I think, has to invent, I wouldn't say rediscover, it has to invent the planning process. Because with the Planning Commission gone, the whole planning process and budgeting and its linkage to budgeting is something that the states have to do better. That's where you have to invest in state capability. The Chinese invested in the planning system quite a bit and tuned it to their needs. India has to create its own planning framework, but that's something extremely important and necessary. But I think the most important lesson here is you can look at South Africa, you can look at China, many things to be learned from these places. But ultimately, the challenge is understanding your own local context and seeing how it bridges into the local context.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, sir. We're running out of time now. So would each one of you like to give some concluding remarks, and then we can bring this session to a close.
Okay.
So we can start with you.
Srikanth, Ramesh, and Dr. Junaid Ahmad in that order. A few concluding remarks, and then we'll close.
Yeah. So I think we need to focus on the how and not the what. Repeating the same problem statements ad nauseum over a period of time is not going to give us solutions. We need to sharply identify key stakeholders who are outside of government, like Ramesh mentioned, who are largely like-minded in their objectives, and sharply focus on the touch points within the political system, on the nerve impulses in the political system, which when pressed will give you the consequences that you desire. You have to operate on two tracks. There has to be a long-term structural strategic track. We have to brace ourselves for a 15-year journey on that front, given the political economy factors. But there is also a short-term tactical track, which will build trust with people in the administrative system and political system, where you give them what they want. Help them raise more capital, invest that capital more effectively, produce outputs and outcomes which improve their electability, which for bureaucrats improve their ACRs, make them look good, help them with technology solutions.
Ramesh?
So I just want to thank JP. I think, we wouldn't have done this if a week or 10 days ago he hadn't reached out, and I'm constantly in admiration of his indefatigable spirit to see change happen. I have to unlearn some of the things, when we are not even products of the system. So you've spent a career in the civil service and then 20 years in advocating for change. I've only got the second half of that, and I'm already exhausted. So there's a lot to be inspired by you, and I'm so happy we decided to do this, be a part of this, and take your lead on it. So, whoever's listening, I think the message that Srikanth made is important, which is these are marathons, but they are possibly marathons of sprints. So whenever we get a chance, go forward. A very famous, very successful institution builder in the public sphere, once gave me a very pithy metaphor. He said, building public institutions is like being stuck on a highway with full of traffic jams. Very often you don't move. Sometimes the road opens up on the left. You have to squeeze in on the left. Sometimes you get a free road for 2 kilometers, so you go at 60 kilometers an hour. But the bottom line is you can't make any progress unless you're sitting at the wheel. So you have to constantly be sitting at the wheel and keep your eyes and ears open. So I think some of this change is like that.
Thank you, Ramesh. Dr.
Ahmad? Very much would like to echo what Ramesh has said, and thank you, JP, and thank you to FDR for pulling us together to have this conversation. And a personal thank you for bringing me back to see my friends that I don't see that often, Ramesh and Swati and Srikanth and Yamini. So thank you very much. I think that the future of India lies in the states of India. But the states of India can't move forward without a rethinking of what the third tier will do. And it's extremely important that those who are listening really invest their own perspectives on what this third tier means and how to move the third tier. And a very big part of the third tier is urban India. We are not used to in South Asia thinking about urban. Our political history is of rural victories. And that has to be celebrated. But today's India is an urban India. Today's South Asia is an urban South Asia. There are two regions that are still urbanizing. One is Africa and one is South Asia. Africa is urbanizing at speed. South Asia is urbanizing at scale. And I think that the future lies in young generation investing in understanding that process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Junaid. I'll make a couple of points. Let me take off where Dr. Ahmad left. Very important point he made. At the end of the day, it's about federalism. I grew up in rural India myself. For me, when at 300,000, town was a big city. And Hyderabad, when I first came, it was formidable. But romanticism apart, from a purely democratic standpoint of view, management standpoint of view, and the citizens' voice point of view, I'm saying it with great pain and hopefully some degree of truthfulness. It's very hard to mobilize the villages of India to become self-governing because we killed their initiative and dignity and self-esteem and self-reliance. 60 years ago, 70 years ago, when there was no money, people had the sense of the collective entity. Despite poverty, they were contributing for their schools, for their roads, for their health centers, out of their pocket. I have seen it. I'm a product of that. But today we killed it because of the democratic compulsions. We made people mendicants and we made them dependent overly on what the government gives. Cities give us a hope because they have talent. There is money. You can raise resources. As pointed out by Srikanth, 80%, even today, the big cities are able to manage 80% resources on their own. Though they have a right for fiscal devolution, they have the right, they have the ability to make, to raise voice. They have a consciousness that they are taxpayers. In India and South Asia in general, we don't see ourselves as taxpayers. But increasingly, in the cities, they recognize their taxpayers, not only at the federal and state level, but at the local level. Therefore, they're resentful of the raw deal. They're not getting what is due to them. And therefore, there is hope. That's the reason why, apart from the fact that it's easier to persuade the political system to part with a little bit of their power rather than all the power in third tier. This is the reason why, because the demand side probably can be generated more in cities than in rural areas. Otherwise, the broader arguments that we made today are applicable to the whole of the country if we believe in democracy. And I believe that we can make a difference. This will be put in the public domain. All the discussion with your permission, whatever we have had, everybody will have access to it? No, because there is an increasing body of people who would like to know what is happening, what some of the influential thinkers and some of the scholars and people who dedicated their time and energy for these causes in a non-partisan way, what they're thinking is taken seriously by a small band of people across the country. And ultimately, I truly believe in Margaret Mead's adage, there is a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens who make change possible. It's not always millions of people who are marching. We require to rouse public opinion, but ultimately, it's a group of people who know what to fight for. And more important than anything else, that's one thing I've discovered in my life's journey, is the power of the context. It's not so much that you're smart, you're great, you're bright, your ideas are wonderful. But are you opportunist enough in the best sense of the term? Can you seize a moment? Sometimes if you seize the right moment, some seemingly impossible change can happen within half an hour. I've seen it happen. Sometimes even simple things took decades. So the power of the context is one of the most important engines of change. And that is the hope why we have taken up this theme of crisis as opportunity. And to take this forward, as I said, we will take a short break because we need to rethink, regroup, and decide what to do about these 3 webinars that we had, namely on healthcare, which is directly related to the COVID crisis, and India is desperately in need of a fundamental change in healthcare system without costing too much, because as Yamini said, there's not much money in Delhi or elsewhere. So with the least amount of money, what is the best that we can do? Leveraging our strengths. I believe there is a solution. Many of us are coming around to the point of view. The second is agriculture. Government does not put a single rupee. Let them remove the roadblocks and do some right things, and the people will take care of it. And the third, of course, today we discussed this, but the way forward, what to do next? I think we'll be engaging with each of you and with many others systematically and see how best we can take this forward, a bit at a time, sometimes big changes, sometimes small changes. And if the government has appetite at the national, at the state level, a package of changes, let's see how it works. And as Dr. Ahmad said, if you allow 1,000 flowers to bloom, if you allow each state to experiment, in fact, one of the great downsides of the 74th Amendment is we didn't allow the 1,000 flowers to bloom. We gave one template, a rigid structure. Therefore, the states had no incentive to innovate. Otherwise, Karnataka was trying to do a good job before that in local governments. But even that is dead, unfortunately. So we have to really figure out how to make federalism work truly, because it may not happen in one fell swoop all over the country. And the next 3 things after some breather will be on school education. Indian education is in deep crisis. COVID has not created the crisis. In fact, I'm telling people very truthfully, though half playfully, it doesn't matter whether schools run or not, because when they were running, nothing much happened in India. Let's not delude ourselves. Therefore, the disruption to school education actually is an opportunity to rethink and then make something really big happen. Then the services, in general service delivery, India seems to work only in crisis time. Other times, well, we all know what happens. Can we move slowly in the direction of some predictable, guaranteed service delivery accountability? And finally, rule of law, at least some limited aspects of rule of law, particularly because urban India, there are implications to rule of law more than rural India, growth of urbanization and impersonal lives. Can we look at this crisis as a starting point to bring about at least a couple of significant changes in the framework of rule of law? We know what is wrong from the Kanpur encounter the other day to Hyderabad encounter to the 80% people who are now incarcerated in jails without trial, under trials, essentially poor people. From 10% of people only getting convicted in the country and 90% let off because there simply is no investigation or prosecution ability. And third degree is the favorite method of investigation. I mean, these are wrong. We may have normatively constitutional rule of law, but in reality, we all know what is wrong. There's no point blaming XYZ. We have to look at it systematically, at least in some respects. And women's safety, included particularly in urban areas, the sense of safety, the fear of safety is a big thing. Can we use that to do something about it? These are the 3 things we'd like to take that. Thank you all for this wonderful participation, the panelists who gave so generously not only their time, but also their wisdom and their experience, the benefit of their expertise, and the participation of hundreds of young people from all over the country on Saturday afternoons. Now, I mean, it takes a special kind of madness, and good that there is that madness still alive and kicking. Thank you all once again. Have a nice weekend. Good evening and goodbye.